The evolution of NFL offensive and defensive strategy and its impact on fantasy football. That's what we're going to talk about today on The Long View, a new podcast for myself, Ben Gretch. You can find my Substack Stealing Signals at bengretch.substack.com. And my new co-host on this endeavor, Jakob Sanderson. You can find his great Substack, Thinking About Thinking, at jakobsanderson.substack.com. A couple of Substack newsletter writers here. And this is our new podcast, Jacob, that we have been talking about doing for a couple of years. You and I have known each other for a while now and have talked for a while about potentially working together in one way or another, potentially doing a podcast together. We have been working on this throughout this offseason, made the decision a couple of months ago to be doing this. It took us a little longer to get this first podcast, this first episode recorded than we anticipated, for a variety of reasons. There's some things about the pod that we want to go over at the top, but first of all, how you doing? Excited to be doing this with you.
I'm doing great, man. I'm excited. We've been circling this, like you said, for like multiple years, like in some form, and super pumped to finally have like an official show to do with you. I remember back when you were doing your own YouTube streams for a while, and I hopped on those a bunch, and we had a ton of fun. And I remember, people seem to enjoy the pairing, so hopefully they're going to enjoy it because they're going to get a lot of it in short order coming here.
That's right. So I was doing a Stealing Signal. I was doing slow drafts on YouTube, and I would have guests on at times. And I mean, people liked a lot of the different guests, had a lot of fun guests on, but I did get a few specific pieces of feedback that were like, I love this combination. I love you two working together. Those who know our two newsletters will know that we think about things somewhat similarly. One of the reasons I'm really excited about doing this with you is that I like to work with people. I talk about this in the newsletter. I've talked about it with the different people I've worked with. We've both had the great luxury of working with Pat and Pete at Ship Chasing. I eventually left there after several years, and you've been doing it since then as one of my replacements with Davis Maddock. And I mean, they're awesome guys to work with. My opportunity to work with them and to work with Sean Siegel and the different people I work with, what I always emphasize is I like to work with people who I think of the fantasy football very similarly to on a foundational level, so that the conversations can be those second and third order conversations. Because there are times when I've done content throughout my career where, without being able to necessarily agree on the base level things, you spend a lot of time. I mean, sometimes that's interesting too, because you get different flavors and different angles at things, but you do spend a lot of time just sort of on the surface level saying, I like this guy or I don't like this guy. And it's really for very different reasons. Analytically, we'll be more aligned, and that will be a lot of fun hopefully for the listeners. One of the notes about both of us is both of us are a little bit longer-winded, and people will know that. I'm sure that know either of us. That gets to the title, The Long View, which for anyone who doesn't know anything about the concept, the Long View is a concept I've thrown out in the newsletter over the years as like a way of looking at players that are looking at players on a longer timeline, on a longer view, and the market often responds to things that have happened in really short order. I think two really good situations, there'll be better ones, but two really good situations this year are in Arizona and Jacksonville in the pass-catching cores, where you have like Michael Wilson and Parker Washington, who both had great years last year, but they'd be more like short view guys. You're kind of just building off 2025, and they have teammates in Marvin Harrison and Brian Thomas Jr., who had a lot more draft capital, a lot more interesting prospect profiles coming out, and they would be more like long view players. You got to remember like what they did in college to think back to why you might be optimistic about a player like a Marvin Harrison or a Brian Thomas after tough seasons last year. And so that's the kind of analytical framework that both of us do subscribe to and do a lot of our work around. And I think there's a real edge with that. And so that will also be a big part of, in addition to, us talking a lot, that will also be a big part of the way that we discuss content on the show.
Totally. I think that's going to be, I think last year in many ways was like one of the big years for that long view-esque idea, where you saw certain guys that were maybe a little bit more difficult to like strictly project wind up having these big leaps in their season. Like you think of like a JSN, you think of a Jonathan Taylor, you think of even like a guy like a George Pickens, who gets in a new situation and really shines. Like I think there was a ton of that last year, and excited to talk through some of those guys this year for sure. I also wanted to go in a little bit of what the show is going to be. So we're working on what we've been loosely calling the freemium model. So you're listening to this episode. Everyone that wants to listen to this episode can listen to this episode, and that's going to be the case for all of our regular episodes, which will be roughly one a week that we're going to be able to do. That's going to be available wherever you get your podcasts. We are also going to have a Patreon. And the way that I would put this is there's going to be some stuff that we will put there that'll be only for Patreon subscribers. That'll include some drafts that we're going to do together throughout the rest of the summer. It may include some other stuff. We'll see where we get there. Most of all, it's sort of if you want to support the show, we would really, really invite that. And we're going to hopefully have, a lovely community of folks who want to do that. But that's going to be, I think, what we should expect going forward from the show. We're super, super excited for it, and we'll see how it evolves from there.
Yeah, the main thing that we wanted to drive home with this model, and when we first talked, we didn't know if we were going to do it this way or another way. We both have had success at the Substacks that we've written, letting our subscribers and our fans and people who like our content support us directly. We're going to do like no ads on the show and those things, at least for the time being. I don't know. There's a possibility of anything in the future. We have no idea where this is going to go, but for the immediate future, like we don't want to set up an ad model or anything like that. We just want to give people the opportunity to support us directly. Hopefully that allows us to make enough money to make this into something that we want to keep doing and can keep doing. And that's a model that's worked for us in our newsletters. I know it's less common in the podcast space, and I'm sure some people will not love that, but I want to be clear that we're not going to put a ton of stuff. Like we don't know what we'll put behind it, but you and I have talked through this and been like, look, we're mostly just creating this opportunity for people to have like the voluntary ability to support the show if they want to, and there will be some things that we then do to sort of justify that. But at the same time, one of the things you and I both don't want to do, because we do have our own newsletters and other things that we're doing, is overpromise too much as it relates to a new subscription-based thing. We're basically not promising anything. But as you said, one thing we will do between now and week one is we will do some drafts together that we thought that those shows would make sense as behind the paywall. So if you want to get our specific working together shows, then you'll get those. But all the shows we do on analysis and those kinds of things are regular weekly show. We're just going to keep free, and we're not going to expect anybody to subscribe just to be a listener to the show or anything like that. So far more content in front of the paywall than behind, I would say. At the same time, we want to encourage anyone who does want to support us, because that will help us continue to do the show. I mean, like who knows what will become of this, how long we'll be doing it, all of those things. One of the things with the freemium model is if enough people want to subscribe and it scales up and all of those things, then it gives us incentive to continue to do more shows and to make stuff 100%. That's free and paid, and make this something that is a big deal for both of us. So that's the freemium model that obviously exists out there in some places and people are aware of, but I think is key for us to emphasize that we're not promising too much or anything, and we're also not expecting anything. You're not going to be left out from the bulk of the content if you're not a paid subscriber. So all those things very important. But with that, Jacob, we're going to go to our first little segment. And so every episode we've talked through kind of how we want to do this. We're going to probably go pretty long on some stuff. When I remember 2 years ago, we did one of our drafts and we got into a discussion about Anthony Richardson and about the fourth or fifth round. It was the year he was going really, really high.
And you were correct.
Yeah, I was a little more down on him. But what I remember about this specifically is the comments that we kept talking about Anthony Richardson until like the 15th round. Like in between every pick, we had a discussion about it. So the whole draft became a conversation about Anthony Richardson and the Colts and how that affects other players and projections and all of these things. And I think a really good conversation. People seem to really like it. as we really broke down the nuances of that profile. It's something that you and I both really like to do, is roll up our sleeves and get deep into the analytical stuff. At the same time, because we're going to have a lot of those kinds of discussions on the show, number one, we're not going to limit ourselves time-wise. We may have some pretty long shows. And number two, those will be sort of our long view concept of the week. We're also going to start every show with the short view, which will be a quick rundown. Jacob will be. I'm super excited about this because I don't have to do the work. When I used to work at CBS, I loved working with Adam Azer, who's the podcast host over there, and he would always do a news and notes segment at the beginning, and I'd always pick up on some stuff that had slipped through the cracks for me. And I have 2 kids, for people who don't know, and I'm a little bit less engaged at this stage of my life than I was prior. One of the really exciting things for me about doing this podcast with you is getting this like youth invigoration, because I have my other podcast, Stealing Bananas with Sean, who's a little older than me. So now I'm gonna have these two-man podcasts, one with a guy that's a little bit older, that's kind of a mentor to me, one with you that's a little bit younger, who I think you're just an incredible analyst, coming up a little later than me on timeline wise, but certainly in no way any less than or anything like that, but a lot more engaged, a lot more free time. You don't have children like I do, and so you. In a lot of the, well, at least that you know of, and you in a lot of the,
I'm pretty sure, for the record.
Pretty sure. In a lot of the episodes, and especially in these first few weeks, and especially as training camp hits, this short view will be you maybe running down some news and notes. There will be other times where maybe it's an opportunity to talk about some specific topic or thing that you want to get, like maybe a quick thought from me on, or whatever, or you want to. Whatever. You're going to have full reign to kind of structure this how you want. But every show, the first 10 or 15 minutes, today we're taking a little longer to explain the podcast, but first 10 or 15 minutes will be the short view. We'll run through a few different topics. It won't just be one short view topic. It'll be maybe 3, it'll be 5, it'll be 8, depending on what you think is interesting for that particular episode. And so people who don't have as much time to listen to us talk for 2 hours about Anthony Richardson or whoever the topic du jour is that day, topic du jour that day. I just did the ATM machine thing, I believe.
Yeah, topic today that day.
Yeah. Yeah, you are a Canadian. You would know. I like to mix in my French. I'm cultured.
Yeah, that's good. There you go.
So anyway, let me kick it over to you for the short view. What do we got for this first episode short view?
So today's going to be a little different. It's not going to be a news-based segment to let people in behind the scenes. That's because we're recording this before we have a podcast yet. So wanted to pick something a little evergreen. This is probably a few days before this actually goes live. And I also thought it would be fun to level set kind of what the show is about in player form. So we're going to talk about quick rundown of some of the guys that I think best epitomize this long view concept. Some of the guys who've kind of already done that, some of the guys we're expecting to see that from this year, and then a little bit into where the market is treating some of these long view ideas these days. So probably the first guys that I wanted to hit on is like the guys that have clearly ascended, and so we're talking about guys like Jahmyr Gibbs, Jonathan Taylor, AJ Brown were all profiles that I felt like we were very, very in on, the two of us, certainly not only the two of us, but that we're very in on, aggressively ahead of market when they were coming out, when they had success early in their careers, and all I think are interesting spots this year. Jahmyr Gibbs, for the first time now, as I think the consensus 101, he was both of our RB1s last year going into the season. AJ Brown finally getting into this really interesting situation where he might actually finally be in a top half pass volume offense for the first time in his career. We've seen his ADP rebound even off of a poor season. And of course, Taylor had one of the most impressive seasons of his career. Wanted to get your thoughts on those guys and sort of how they epitomize this concept in your mind. And then we're going to talk about some of the guys that we think might be kind of the next generation of these longer view brand type players for us too.
Yeah, those are great ones. I mean, those are guys that have been big ones for I know both of us. I was going to say for me in the last several seasons in terms of my own teams and my own play. And they're great examples of players that had the really great prospect profiles, had the draft capital. In some cases, didn't necessarily have the perfect landing spot. Like A.J. Brown originally in Tennessee was the famous one where you had to bet on talent over situation. Brock Bowers going to the Raiders. I mean, we saw last year how, I mean, obviously in addition to his injury, but the situation was just such a disaster with the offensive line. And I think they had, whatever it was, 5 games with I say whatever it was. I mentioned this on a recent ETR projections podcast, and I saw this stat while going through my projections, but something like 5 games or 7 games where they had 100 total air yards or fewer as a team passing vertically, like could not get the ball down the field, which like the rest of the league combined for like roughly the same amount. Their rate of games that were like no vertical pass volume because, you know, Geno Smith couldn't get the ball out and you had a happy feet and you had the, you know, offensive line issues and all these things was dramatically higher. And then just a poorly conceived offense. Everything you could possibly want to be a bad situation was bad for Bowers last year. We've had these things. We had it with JT for a stretch. Early in his career, it was better. And more recently, obviously last year, we get Shane Steichen in there. We get a more favorable offense, and we see again how good that talent is, which goes back to the long view thing, and you stick with that. Even as a player underwhelms at points in given seasons, that's one of the advantages of this long view way of thinking is you're like, man, Jonathan Taylor back at Wisconsin, you know, we both believe being a workhorse is a skill, and this is a guy who could tote the rock like nobody's business at Wisconsin, had the athletic profile, tested like an absolute freak of nature, and early in his career showed off that all translated, and he, you know, was essentially an immediate superstar. And so anyway, these are great examples of guys that even as they go through rocky periods in their career, and there's always a downslope to players' careers, so a guy like A.J. Brown's getting up there, there's, you know, going to be a reasonable debate. Some people think he's over the hill. I probably fall more in the optimistic perspective on him in new digs with the Patriots this year, but these are guys where the underlying ability, I mean, and that is so crucial at the NFL level. Can you overcome all the situations that you're in? The underlying ability is so strong. A more recent breakout example maybe is like a JSN who had a great prospect profile. I'm just thinking of him last year. Just the underlying ability was so clear, even as he got tasked with being like the only show in town, and he wound up having 44% of the team's receiving yardage. I mean, just absolutely absurd. And as teams are trying to key on that more and more throughout the season, he continues to hit because there's guys that are that good. I mean, Jamar Chase has been that guy over the course of his career. You can throw to me, and his ADOT is like lower than it should be, but it's like, because you can throw to me every single time, I'll get open even though everyone's trying to stop me. And there's only certain players that once they become the center piece and the focal point of the defensive game plan can still produce. And these are the pinnacle of the long view types.
Definitely. So this year, we had talked a little bit about who some of these guys that might, you know, that haven't gotten all the way up to the absolute apex, but that we're excited about this year and going forward in this type of mindset. And 3 of the names that stuck out, 2 second-year guys, so which are Colston Loveland and Tetairoa McMillan. I know you've been working on the Bears projection just now. We were talking about it a little bit pre-show. I just wrote a big piece about the Bears and about Loveland and why I'm so optimistic about him. I recently listened to you talking about Tetairoa over on the ETR pod and got even more excited than I already was about him this year. And then one guy that I wanted to throw it to that is a little bit further in, and he reminds me of guys like Stephon Diggs, DJ Moore, of guys who, you know, had the really, really strong pedigree, didn't necessarily have it all come together right away for various reasons in the way that we might have hoped or that we thought was capable of. But then, you know, both those guys, Diggs especially, eventually wound up having a huge hit and a huge middle section of his career. We're hopeful this guy can find that too. And it's Garrett Wilson, who's, I think, available more cheaply than he's been this year since his rookie year. He's going in the 4th round, and interestingly, more cheaply this year than last year. Where while I'm not going to say that the Jets are like some great situation, but I find myself much more optimistic about the Jets this year with Geno Smith and some of their weapons than I was last year, from fantasy at least, with Justin Fields. I'm going to be, all these guys are going in a really similar range of the draft, actually. I'm trying my best to be overweight all three of them, and wanted to hear your thoughts on those guys as well.
Yeah, I mean, the year 2 guys I think are pretty straightforward. Wilson is super fun. He's a great example of the long view concept because he was a really great prospect, and people didn't like the landing spot coming into his rookie year, and so he was way cheaper than he should have been for a guy with first-round draft capital and the profile he had, and was a pretty big hit as a rookie with what's still his career-high yards per route run, and he ran a lot of routes right away out of the gate and had a very good first season, and then it's been worse every year since, which doesn't really make a lot of sense, especially if you're somebody who does actually watch all the games and those things. I mean, he's done some pretty incredible stuff. The year 2, he was supposed to have Aaron Rodgers, and Aaron Rodgers tears his Achilles immediately, and then and I say Aaron Rodgers, a lot of people think that Aaron Rodgers sucks, but that was supposed to be an upgrade. And then year 3, he did get Rodgers, but off an Achilles injury. I mean, Aaron Rodgers had a pretty tough year, and then they trade for Devontae Adams midseason to try to kind of appease Rodgers and make this version of the Jets team work in a way that it was pretty clearly, doomed. But all of these things have been not great for Garrett Wilson's development and situation. Last year, as you noted, with Fields, I was pretty out on him too because of the you have a name for it, but I was just describe the concept.
Drop back conversion rate.
Drop back conversion rate. I love it. Just the idea of the number of dropbacks that turn into pass attempts. There's 3 outcomes on a dropback: a sack, a scramble, or a pass attempt. And on the sacks and scrambles, you don't get a target. You don't get any receiving production. The quarterback holds the ball too long. Justin Fields is the poster boy for this concept. Because he gets sacked at an incredibly high rate and he scrambles at an incredibly high rate. And it's at times as much as 30% of his dropbacks don't even become pass attempts, which is a crazy high combination of sack rate and scramble rate for both of those to be approaching 15%. For a lot of other guys, it's going to be 10% total, 5% for both.
Historically, the guys who are the highest DCR guys, like Dak, Matthew Stafford, Kirk Cousins when he was at his prime, they were living in a 92% drop back conversion rate compared to guys like Fields who have been in the high 60s, low 70s for a lot of their career.
So, I mean, that's a big reason I know both you and I were a little bit more skeptical of Wilson from a more of a pure projection standpoint last year, and yet he came out playing pretty well last year. He actually had his best yards per out run since that rookie year, was drawing a lot of volume. His targets per out run has been very good every year. The yards per target side has kind of held him back, but his yards per out runs every year, they haven't been terrible or anything. If you do, like I said, kind of watch it, you see a guy who looks, for the most part throughout his career, like the pretty clear number 1. I say the most part, that stretch with Devontae Adams, maybe a little bit more where he was kind of the secondary guy, but most of the time he has looked like the clear number 1. He's also made some really good plays at the catch point. He has some awesome one-handed catches to this point in his career that kind of go back to what the skill set from Ohio State. His evasion numbers with the ball, ball and hand stuff, have still been really good, though his yak hasn't necessarily been great, just in part because to try to get him going, they've done some short area throws and things, but there's always a tension on him. He's never really been in an offense that creates any kind of room for him to maneuver or operate. I think of him like DJ Moore, who I was really into from a long view perspective throughout his first few years in Carolina, and people were always really down on him, and they said he's never going to score touchdowns and this and that. And he did finally have a pretty big season in Carolina, and then he had the big season with the Bears as well, coincidentally with Justin Fields. And look, DJ Moore's never become a really high-end number 1, which, if you looked at some of his prospect numbers, you may have expected at some point, but I'm excited. I haven't done the Jets projection. It's one of the last few I need to get done. But Garrett Wilson is one that I assume I'll wind up pretty high on again. Injured for most of last season, and I'm pretty excited to see what could happen for him because I know for a lot of people, they want what we've seen to be the only thing that's occurred. And, every season is kind of a small sample. And it is sort of the Occam's razor, explanation that maybe Wilson's just not that good, but the more complex explanation is sometimes accurate. And in this case, it may be that he's just been in some really bad situations, even though it's been 4 years and a lot of people are impatient. They're like, when's it going to hit? Well, I mean, maybe it'll hit a little bit later for this guy because some guys do get the tough situations year in and year out. So anyway, he's another one. I love you bringing up because, I do truly believe in that talent still. And then you mentioned McMillan and Loveland, who are super, super fun. Loveland, a 21-year-old rookie last year, didn't turn 22 until April, has the huge breakout late that I don't think everyone understands because it was sort of after fantasy season. It started in like week 16, 17, 18 into the postseason. But he had 80+% routes in like 4 straight weeks, and he had over 90 receiving yards in 3 of those. He had 10+ targets for 4 straight games. If you haven't gone back and like looked at his game log at the end of the year and into the postseason as they were trying to get into the playoffs, that's what a late season rookie, upswing in usage can look like. And when it's a 21-year-old tight end, I think we've gotten kind of numb to how hard it is for rookie tight ends to be as productive as Loveland was late in the year. You're going into age 22. This is a first-round draft capital guy. And also, as bad as J.J. McCarthy was last year, I mean, this guy, 2 of his 3 collegiate seasons were with J.J. McCarthy, and he had good per-route numbers at Michigan. And it's made me rethink him.
And his third season, like, I don't know how, like, they had, like, completely incapable quarterback play. They were playing, like, they played, like, I think 4 or 5 different quarterbacks, and half of them were, like, only running. There were games that they were playing a 2-quarterback system because they couldn't move the ball down the field. Like, it was... Basically, his last season at Michigan, it was like their only offense was either run the ball, and then like 6 or 7 times a game they would try to throw the ball to Colson Loveland, and maybe they'd get it within his like area, and then he'd be able to catch it. Oh, Jesus Christ!
You did the 6 or 7 thing. My daughters would absolutely love that. Tedero McMillan.
The kids I have around town that I don't know about would like that too.
That's right, exactly. Yeah. Tedero McMillan, another one. He only had like I say only, but he had like a 1.85 yards per out run, and then they weren't very pass heavy. The Panthers as a team, very low in pass rate over expected last year, had several games, both when they were winning, they were trying to win low-scoring games, and when they got beat, where they just went run heavy and basically allowed themselves to be blown out. I don't have the stat right in front of me, but when I went through the projections, it was something like all but like 3 of their losses, I think it was like 6 of their 9 losses were double digits. And then they went 8-9. I think like 7 of their 8 wins were by 1 score, and a bunch of them were just by a field goal. So it's like they won all the close, low-scoring 1-score games, and then when they lost, they just let themselves be blown out. They didn't even get garbage time and a lot of extra routes in those scenarios. But McMillan winds up with a strong year 1 per route profile, in my opinion. I mean, it's not, you love to see it over 2. I'm using the PFF numbers. It was like a 1.85-ish. But still very, very good. Good volume, solid enough efficiency. And then when you go to the long view and you say, this is a 3-year early declare who had the really great collegiate stuff, I think you have to look at him as a profile that, as another one, was a young rookie, is going to continue to develop. So those are all really great ones that could be the next class of stars, of just really good. I mean, the Loveland one, like, that guy's just good at football. If he was that productive with J.J. McCarthy and with the quarterbacks you were saying, and then what he was able to do late last season at age 21 at the NFL level, like, that's the idea of the Longview stuff, where it's like you're just so confident this player is incredibly good at football. And those guys, the cream tends to rise to the top. Those are the guys that you want to be on when the market is maybe too fixated on, situation or things like that. Loveland's price is obviously up there this year as a tight end 3, but in other situations like Garrett Wilson, there's maybe the opportunity to lean into that.
What I love the most about Loveland is, and kind of hard not to compare it to his teammate in this respect. Like, for the entire season, his numbers were really strong. He had 23% targets per out run, 1.97 yards per out run. That would be an amazing season for any rookie wide receiver. It would especially be an amazing season for one who's 21 years old, and when you consider he's a tight end, I think it just gets even more impressive. But like you mentioned, he got the full-time role at the end of the year, and then his efficiency numbers actually got even better in the full-time role than he had over the course of the season. He finishes the year in those final 4 games with 2.75 yards per route run. I love seeing, in a small sample, of course, but like already proof of concept that, we scale this guy up from, a 60% routes roll up to an 85% routes roll, and he's actually getting even better. He's getting even more efficient. You love seeing that. And with Tataroa, I think that's another part of it too, where because he kind of just came in, week one, he was already the number one wide receiver on that team. And I feel like there's a tendency for this industry sometimes where when guys don't have that kind of natural linear progression pattern, where they start off in a part-time role, then they start to get more efficient, and then they maybe get more snaps, and it's kind of easier sometimes for those players for people to project year 2, year 3 growth for. Versus a guy like McMillan who just comes in as the 8th overall pick. He's the starter from day one. He's really good from day one. And I feel like a lot of the stuff I've seen around him is like, oh, well, he's good, sure, but like, is he really that great? Because he didn't even have over 2 yards per route run, and he's got Bryce Young problems, which that part I think is very fair. I'm quite bearish on Bryce Young, and I think he is a legitimate limiting factor. But I think that there's an element to which people see McMillan as closer to a finished product because he came in so ready-made in a way that's pretty unfair, where you would almost see people like being more optimistic about internal growth and just like improvement, getting better at the game for a guy who came in less prepared, whose role was more catered early on. And the fact that McMillan was immediately racking up 90% route shares from the jump, I think almost works against him in some people's eyes subconsciously, where like, what if, this year coming in as a 22-year-old player, like again, another 21-year-old early declare guy, he just shows up and he's better in many ways. And he was already really impressive, but like, what if he comes in with significant improvements to his game? I mean, that's what we saw with like a JSN last year is like, yes, DK Metcalf was out of the picture, but like the Jackson Smith and Jigba we saw on the field last year was a fundamentally much better football player than the Jackson Smith and Jigba we saw his first 2 years. And that's part of what we're betting on with some of these guys is you have the signs of the talent ceiling they can get to. That doesn't mean that they show up in the NFL already at their highest point, already at their peak. You have that pedigree and you hope to see over the course of time them already start at a high level, but just continue to have that self-improvement. I'm pretty excited to see how high the ceiling can get for Tataroa, and I don't want to discount the possibility that even if the situation remains relatively stable, he's just able to consolidate more volume. He's able to get more efficient. He's able to turn in a higher ceiling.
I love
the
that
last
point.
thing.
I love that note about McMillan specifically, because he started so in such a big role and throughout the season. It's like, oh, this is what he is or something, and that's the whole point I think for him going into year 2. One of the reasons I was really into Stealing Signals subscribers will know that I was a little bit too into Deontay Johnson a couple of years ago, because Dave Canales was talking about him as the wide receiver he was basically going to build his offense around, structure his offense around. And he had done that the year prior with Mike Evans, and he was kind of he's like, when I was at Tampa, I remember the quotes. When I was at Tampa, I had Mike Evans, and we kind of built the passing game around this one, wide receiver. That's kind of the way he thinks about his offense, as sort of building it around a number one wide receiver, and then or the passing game, and then working off of that. Maybe McMillan. I think McMillan was clearly that guy last year for him, but I don't think from week 1 of your rookie season that Dave Canales is expecting Tataroa McMillan to be so established and so good that he can do that to the degree that he was sort of talking about it, even with a Deontay Johnson. Going into year 2, that's one of the things that I'm really excited about with the Panthers is I do think that Canales is going to be more proactive of being like, all right, he showed it in year 1. He showed that the transition wasn't impossible or anything, right? Like, he's good enough. Now what's the next step? Where are we going to go? How are we going to lean more into this dude and make him more of a focal point of everything that we're doing? And that's really what I expect going into year 2. So I think that one's really fun. Cool. So that is what we're calling the short view. It was a little longer today than it will be for most episodes. The idea, it's medium view. The idea for us is that it's an opportunity to force us to talk about more topics. So we did still talk through several different concepts there, several different players. That's what we will do each episode at the beginning, first 15 minutes. Maybe it'll be the first half hour, some shows. But it will allow us or force us to get into a few more topics than usual, because we do like to peel back the layers of the onion and get pretty deep into individual topics. That's what we're going to do for the rest of the day. Today, as we get into our sort of longer view topic for today, and whatever, the structure may not be the exact same every episode forever, but that's sort of the way we're envisioning it. And for now, and the long view topic may be multiple topics sometimes, but for today, for the first episode, in that idea of in that vein of sort of setting the table a little bit for the things that we want to talk about on this show and what we think is important right now in fantasy football. And this is our first episode in July, and the season's right around the corner. And how do we get up to speed for draft season quickly? One of the big things that you and I both talk about a lot in our Substacks and in our content is the macro level stuff. We've done some stuff on it together and sort of referencing each other's work and things like that. At the newsletter, we did some stuff together. We were both guests on a CBS pod recently and went into a lot of this stuff. A lot of you may have already heard us talk through the evolution of the NFL and offensive defensive strategy and the heavy personnel trend and more tight ends and those things. It's been talked about a lot of different places. It's very clear that in the NFL draft, we saw a lot of like blocking tight ends going on day 2. And like those things, we were talking about Loveland a minute ago. The Bears took Sam Roush on day 2. And I think some people are probably like, that's weird. They drafted a tight end. Basically plays an entirely different position, which is something that you know better than I do. But he's basically a blocking tight end only. And if I'm remembering it right, he has like no more than 20 career receptions in a season, or 20 receptions in a season.
Roush actually has like some. He actually has production.
Okay, I'm thinking of Borkercher then from.
Borkercher is the one. Him, and then there's another guy, Marlon Klein, the guy that the Texans took. Those two have virtually no college production. Roush is huge, but he does actually have 2 40-catch seasons out at Stanford.
Which is interesting because they called him in some of their quotes a Y tight end. They said it was important they needed to get a Y tight end at that spot. And then Ryan Poles, the general manager, was talking about it, and then he sort of referenced Durham Smythe, who played that role. Durham Smythe played 17 games last year and got 6 targets. And that's sort of the role that they...
But he probably played like a ton of snaps. Like I felt like I was consistently seeing him on the field.
Yeah, I went and looked at it. It wasn't as many as I thought it might have been as I was kind of writing up the Bears, but it was a decent amount. You're right. I mean, it was definitely a decent amount. He was playing every week. He was playing in packages every week. I don't know if it was double-digit snaps every week, but there were some games where he even got up to 20 snaps and things like that, which an average NFL
And they also
game's
used Benedette as a 6th lineman pretty frequently, and so maybe they wind up consolidating. If they're really confident in Roush's blocking, maybe they consolidate, the Smythe role and that extra O-line role, and it gives them a little bit more versatility. Where, certainly Roush more of a pass catcher than a literal 6th offensive lineman.
So, I mean, not that we want to get specifically into this, but I want to hear your thoughts. Do you think Roush is going to actually catch? Because I ended up projecting him to not get very much volume at all in year 1, and that he would mostly do a lot of the blocking and help in the run game, and then also help in the pass game, and Loveland gets a lot of the targets. Because then there's Kmet, right? And so I had Kmet. Do you think Roush, I guess, does Roush impact Kmet's target rate a decent amount? Or not that I projected him for even really a fantasy role.
I don't think it's going to be a ton. Like, you look at a guy like Charlie Kohler, who's also actually kind of ironically at a different spot, in an interesting spot this year. But he was like a receiving tight end in college. I mean, he was a do-everything tight end in college, but he had 3 years, 44 or more catches. And then you fast forward to him at the pro level, he's basically just been a blocking tight end for Baltimore. He has 4 catches, 7, 9, 10. And usually he's playing in these multi-tight end sets as a point of attack blocker. But because he has some of that receiving background within him, he's a guy who I think, if the defense decides to treat him effectively as a 6th offensive lineman, he can make you pay for that by kind of leaking out a bit downfield. That's kind of what I see with Roush. Is I think he's going to play. They're probably going to play, I think, a decent chunk of 13. I think he gives you a far more versatile formation if you're playing 13 with him, Kmet, and Loveland versus 2 tight ends and a literal 6th offensive lineman. So I think he'll get a little bit, but I think it'll be kind of not trick plays, but almost trick plays in the sense of we're not really getting the ball in with intent, but if you treat this guy like an offensive lineman, we'll throw him the ball. And so I would project no more than 8 to 15 catches, but I think he'll have a meaningful NFL role that allows them to have a pretty interesting 13 personnel with 3 tight ends who all, I think, can block. And, Kmet and Roush are nowhere near as dynamic as Loveland, obviously. But I think they can both, get out and catch the ball a little bit to the point that the defense can't just, treat it like it's a goal line formation.
You mentioned Kohler, and I think that's really interesting. He's over with the Chargers this year as well. 10, 9, 7 receptions the last 3 years. But his yards per target, 9.5, 11.9, 9.7. It's like, when we throw this guy the ball, it's going to be an explosive play usually. I mean, they're going to leak him out, essentially. He's a blocker first, but if you just looked at rate stats, you'd be like, "Oh, this guy's a great tight end." It's because of how he's used situationally that he has those kinds of numbers. But he has at least 1 receiving TD each of those seasons as well, with no more than 10 receptions, 4 total receiving touchdowns on 26 catches over the past 3 years. He's now with the Chargers, who also brought in Njoku and still have Aronde Gadsden, so they have another situation with all of these heavy tight ends. So why don't you talk a little bit about that? The broader, You wrote an incredible piece at your Substack wrapping up a lot of what we've seen, where we're at, why we're there. People are really into this heavy tight end stuff. I want to talk a little bit about everything before that, but let's start there. And then, we'll kind of get, there's so much to discuss as it comes to this stuff. We kind of want to lay the groundwork. We may not get through all of it on today's show. But certainly as far as 2026 is concerned, this is a very highly discussed topic, and I think you do a really great job of talking about it. So what are we seeing with some of these teams like the Chargers and the Bears?
Well, appreciate that. I talked about both those teams in my piece, and I talked about a lot of things in my piece. First of all, basketball for, I think, probably about the first 1,500 words. But if you check it out on my Substack, it's a totally free piece to read if you're not a subscriber. It's called "The NFL's Tight End Revolution Will Not Be Linear, but It Will Be Televised." And I kind of drew out a long-running analogy to when the Warriors, way back, the 2015 Warriors debuted their death lineup, and in which it was the small ball Warriors. And there were, I thought, a lot of simplistic takeaways if you were following basketball media at the time that were like, oh, okay, we're in the small ball era. Everybody's going to play small ball now. And, there were certain archetypes of players who really lost ground in the league. There was 2 guys I focused on my piece, Andre Drummond and Greg Monroe, who were pretty traditional bully ball centers who really fell out of favor when they were guys that were centerpieces for teams at the time. But also that it wasn't really quite as two-dimensional as some commentators thought it would be. Certainly wasn't as two-dimensional as I think some teams that were trying to do copycat tactics were able to have success with. And really, if you were to come up with one takeaway of how basketball has evolved over the last kind of decade since that, and I went through it in a lot more detail than I'll say here, is that the takeaways were kind of obvious. It's we want guys who can defend on the perimeter, who can defend the rim, and can shoot. And it's no shit, you want guys that can do everything that's really necessary in the sport, if you can. And it's obviously not every team is going to have guys that have the level of versatility of a Draymond Green. I talked a lot about Al Horford as a guy who kind of became a perfect modern basketball archetype where he was just really, really versatile in how he could be used on offense and defense. And I think in the NFL, we're going to see something similar where there's always going to be a benefit to versatility and unpredictability in any sport. If you can have guys that can do multiple things, that's a massive advantage for you because you're not allowing the defense to key on you. So, we just talked about the Bears. I think the Bears are a team that is doing the 12, 13 personnel stuff in a way that's actually very intelligent, in a way that I think is going to set them up for success. I think that they have Colston Loveland, who is in my opinion, on track to being one of the best players in the National Football League. I thought he was a phenomenal prospect, and he's a guy that, if you just called him a wide receiver tomorrow, I think would have a pretty strong career, but also provides more as a blocker than a lot of the top receiving tight ends. I think you compare him in line to a Bowers, to a especially a Kincaid or a Pitts. I think he's bringing you a lot more, and so you have a star like him and 2 guys behind him in Kmet and Roush that I certainly don't think are special receivers, but I think on their own could at least be like a Kate Otten, where it's like you're getting a guy who can provide some stuff in the receiving game, and on top of that, provide an edge in the blocking game. And it's like that's a really difficult formation to get your head around if you're a defense, because they're going to come out with 3 tight ends. They can run the ball on you. They have a huge personnel advantage in the run game. And if you don't treat their passing game with respect, they're going to have 2 legitimate stud receivers with Loveland and whichever of Burden and Odunze is out there, and 2 more guys that can hurt you. And that puts you in a serious bind. But, I made some analogies between other sports and to football. But like, I think at the end of the day, if all you're going for is just trying to fill out the slots, and you're just saying, okay, well, I just want to get as many tight ends on the field as possible because that's going to somehow unleash this hidden advantage. That's not really seeing the board properly, because you need to have a specific element of star power and versatility combined, I think, to create that type of advantage. And I think teams that are just trying to pack the line with as many tight ends as possible might not come away with that same type of advantage. Like, for instance, I looked at the Jaguars.
To this point, when I was going through the projection process, and shout out to Coach Speak Index for doing so good with the coaching quotes, I came across a couple of quotes that I think are just incredible from the coaches this offseason. And anyone who's listened to my other podcast knows that I loved the the podcast series called The Play Callers from The Athletic. I believe it was the summer of 2023, and we'll get into sort of how the league was progressing at that time. But the really awesome thing about that was it was mostly coaches from the McVay, Shanahan tree, and they got McVay himself, and I think a little bit of Kyle Shanahan too, and we're able to get these guys on the record talking about what was happening with the different offenses and defenses in the league. And those are the schemes that have then dictated what's happened in the years since. And hearing them talk about what was going on as we were starting to go through this shock to the system. I always describe what's happened about a half dozen years ago, starting about 2020, 2021, as the shock in the way that Taleb talks about it when he in his anti-fragility piece, and we talk about anti-fragility from a fantasy football perspective. But the idea is like, when there's a shock to the system, are you robust? Are you fragile? Are you anti-fragile? Those are these different ways that you can respond to a shock. But shocks are things that change the whole meta, the whole perspective, the whole landscape. And one of the comparisons I like to make is the 2008 financial, collapse and subprime mortgages and how that changed the whole financial world. I always like to make that one because I graduated with a finance degree in 2009, and that's why I do fantasy football for a living. But this, so we had the quotes from McVay in 2023, and he was talking about how the defenses had become unregulated and some of those things. We had quotes from Robert Saleh, who was famously Kyle Shanahan's defensive coordinator, and he was talking about how they could what they wanted to do now after the shift was to take the jabs from the offense, but stay away from the haymaker, meaning we want to try to stop the explosive plays. And this is where the cover 2 shell and getting more defensive backs on the field came from. I'm saying all of this mostly just to set up that as we talk about the tight ends, we got another amazing McVay quote this offseason. Back in, I believe it was in March, it might have even been in February, and he gets asked about the tight end stuff. And I thought this was so great, largely because it's in the part of the offseason where he doesn't even necessarily know what his roster is going to look like. And they were asking him about using 13 personnel again. It was back in March. And he says, yeah, I think if you have the guys that can bring it to life. We had depth at the tight end spot last year, so it was favorable for us. I think the thing we've learned over 9 years is that we can't kid ourselves into thinking that the same things are going to be successful again. We've got to continue to adapt, adjust, and evolve. And the way that I wrote about that was that, to me, this quote is not just him talking about the Rams. It's Sean McVay giving you everything. I mean, he's such a good communicator. I think it's a big reason why the coaches under him go on to success, because he explains, would be my read, that he explains the details of why they do things the way that they do, in a way that, like, Bill Belichick's coaching tree was always terrible. And I think Bill Belichick's the greatest coach of all time. But I think part of that's because Bill Belichick always probably kept stuff a little bit close to the vest. And it was more like he was the secret sauce. I don't know that he was like, I think it was like, everybody do your job, including my coordinators and stuff. And then when they got into the head job, they didn't know how to do that. To me, Sean McVay's more the kind of guy that's like, I'm willing to talk about everything. I'm not holding anything back. I'm an extrovert. Whereas Bill Belichick's probably an introvert, and McVay's just, I'm gonna give you everything that I'm thinking at all times, and we're gonna just talk, and we're gonna collaborate, and we're gonna grow. And if you're coaching for a different team next year, I'll deal with that next year, and I'll continue to iterate, and I'll continue to come up with great ideas, because that's what he does. Even as his underlings go and are successful, he continues to come up with the next great idea. I think he's very clearly one of the best coaches in the league, if not the best, and probably the most influential offensive mind for modern football, just straight up, bar none. And yet, what he's talking about here, he's asked about whether they're going to do 13 personnel in Los Angeles with the Rams, and what he says is applicable to every team. He says, so he's, this idea that we've got to continue to adapt, adjust, and evolve. It matters if you have the guys that can bring it to life. That we had depth at the tight end spot last year is favorable for us. There's so much here about understanding that the defense is going to try to take away what you did well last year. What we've learned over 9 years, we can't kid ourselves into thinking the same things are going to be successful again, because they're going to try to stop that. The defenses are out here trying to stop this stuff as well. He's got to continue to adapt, adjust, and evolve, and every team has to do this. You were just talking about the Jags. The other great quote was from Liam Cohen, and they are heading in a direction where they're definitely going to do some more heavy tight end stuff. But when he was asked about that, he said, I believe that there's going to be an uptick probably in the NFL next year in heavier personnel groupings. I'm not sure we're going to over-rotate to a point where we want to get slower or less explosive. We still have some pretty damn good wideouts that I like to use. And so that word over-rotate, I think, is really telling there, because they did go out and draft 2 new tight ends and extend Brenton Strange, and one of those tight ends they drafted in the second round as a guy who never had 200 receiving yards in a season in college, never had more than 20 catches. The other one, Tanner Koziel, is a guy that you got me on during Dynasty season.
That's our GOAT.
That's our GOAT right there. 94 catch season at Ball State, then 74 the next year. I mean, he's a stud in the day 3 sleeper tight end that I'm actually like legit super excited about, but he's buried in Jacksonville now. But Cohen's comment there is the same thing as McVay saying about whether you're like where your strengths are, right? Like you have to understand what your roster is. And his comment is like, look, we have some pretty damn good wide receivers. We have Brian Thomas and Travis Hunter when he plays on that side of the ball, and Parker Washington and Jacoby Myers. And we're not planning to just run 3 tight ends out there every single time. So when I cut in, you were talking about the tight ends, and when you have 3 on the field, whether that slows you down or makes you a little less explosive, that's what McVay's talking about. That's what Cohen's talking about in this chess match. There's a lot of people that I think that just jamming tight ends on the field like you were talking about is the trend. We're just going to put tight ends on the field and everything's going to be better. And that's not the trend, right?
No, it's not the trend. I think that there are elements to this that are universal, and there are elements that I think are a little bit specific, but I think that the elements that are more specific are more likely to vanish, because I talked about this and charted it through my writing. I've heard you talk about it very, very similar terms on shows and in your writing, that like there's a tendency in NFL discourse, and I would argue even from some of the less sharp front offices or teams in the NFL that they might view it this way, of like every new iteration that comes out, it's like, this is the thing, this is the end point, this is the solve. And maybe if you're thinking about it that way, like it honestly must be kind of frustrating to see like the answer come up and then constantly go away over time. And you're like, I think of it's like you're playing a game of whack-a-mole where you're just constantly trying to hit on the last thing if something came up. And like, really, I think that this tight end thing, it actually makes sense in the context of a larger evolution, which is, you go back to like 20 years ago, any defensive coordinator that you ever heard interviewed in any capacity, I would always say, the most important job of a defense is stop the run. You have to stop the run. And so you're constantly getting these base defenses. And like early on, like kind of when I was first coming up in the fantasy space, was like right around when everyone started passing more. And it was like we'd kind of finally figured out like, hey, passing is more efficient than running. And well, we're just going to pass a lot. And we saw some of these spread teams. Like I remember the Brian Dable Bills teams were running like a bunch of 4 wide receiver sets at times, and they were passing constantly, and they were sometimes even doing like short passing. But they were getting these base defenses, and they're using these slot guys like a Cole Beasley, who are getting matched up against linebackers and just destroying those guys. And you've charted so well the defensive evolution of saying, okay, well, we're not going to let this happen. And if you go out there and you play 10 or 11 personnel now, you're more consistently getting met with more versatile defenses. And I think the tight end stuff is like kind of a natural counter to that in a short term, where if they go, hey, every time we show up with light personnel that suggests we're going to pass, defenses are going to play pass-based personnel. So, maybe what we're going to do as a counter to that is we're going to go into run-based looking personnel, and we're going to hope that the defense then matches with base, and it gives us like our only pathway to being able to pass against base defense. And it's interesting because so much of the discourse around the NFL the last couple of years is about the return of the run game, and about teams reached the point of diminishing returns in the pass game. They have to recommit themselves to the run game, and there's elements to that is fair because it's always going to be about a balance. But I think what's so interesting about the tight end stuff is that it seems like the sharpest teams, the team that has used the heavy personnel packages most effectively is the Rams. And they're the team that's passing out of it most frequently. And they're the team that seems to be using it less about the run game and more about how can we create advantages for the passing game. And, the team that's also used heavy personnel pretty effectively on offense, but that has defended against it very successfully on defense is Seattle. And their answer has been, in large part, the 2 middle fingers, which is like, oh, you want to show up in 13 personnel? We're going to still maintain a flexible defensive backfield, and so you're not going to be able to just game the system against us and pass against us. And if that's what you're going against as a defense, well, then maybe you'd rather just have your receivers. So I think we're at one point of an endless cycle. I wrote in my piece, that this edge, the idea of that you're always going to just be able to make decisions for the defense, that if you want them in base personnel, you just press this 13 personnel button, you'll get them in personnel, and then you can do whatever you want. An edge which is conditional upon someone else's error is not an edge. That's a bubble, and it'll inevitably pop. And I think that specific aspect is we're probably in a fleeting window of time. But there's elements to it that are universal, which is that you're always going to want to have versatility in the NFL to be able to run or pass out of whatever formation you're in. And defensively, of course, you're going to want to be as versatile as well. And I think that what's really underrated through all of this is just who are the actual players on the field. Because, you talk about, we talked about the Rams tight ends. What I think is a little bit unsaid is that the Rams also have 2 really impressive wide receivers. And so it's not even as much about like, oh, how do we get all these tight ends on the field and throw to them? A lot of it is how do we get all these tight ends on the field so we can get a more favorable coverage matchup for Puka Nacua or Devontae Adams. And Seattle, similarly, how do we get more one-on-one coverage opportunities for Jack Smith and Jigba? And on defense, like, do I think other defensive coordinators could learn tactically from Mike Macdonald? Certainly. But would they have the same level of success if they don't have a Nick Emenwari, if they don't have a Byron Murphy, if they don't have just the guys that Seattle has, who I think, in many ways it's a credit to Macdonald and Schneider that not only are they able to adjust tactically, but they're able to have an understanding of the types of players to target that make their scheme work. But at the end of the day, it's like the simplest explanation in a lot of ways that I keep coming back to is like, well, you need to have really good football players. You need to have versatile football players and talented football players, and then build your scheme to that. And I think that's the universal truth. It's going to be the case whether the pass rate is higher or lower across the league, whether there's more tight ends on the field or fewer tight ends on the field, that I think oftentimes, no matter how granular I feel like I dive into this, that I keep coming back to.
For sure. And this point that you made in your piece about it being a bubble is the same concept of, there are a lot of people. So one of the things that we run into a lot, especially being fantasy football analysts, is people are like, well, real ball knowers think this stuff and real football, people think this. And I mean, when I was coming up, there was always a stats versus film thing, and the film guys thought they knew way more than the fantasy football analysts didn't understand how football worked. Nowadays, most people like us, most fantasy football analysts try to pair the stats with film and understand that. And I actually think there's a pretty strong argument to be made that the market goes too far with some of the stats without contextualizing the film stuff. And so I wind up on the opposite side of the argument than I was when I was coming up, where I was the stats nerd. And now I wind up being like, you guys need to watch football and understand the sport a little bit better. But this bubble and this evolution that you're talking about is this point that was always thrown out there that was like, you guys don't understand that everything in football is just cyclical. There's ebbs and flows, and all of these things circle back to the things that already were, and this and that and the other thing. And what I want to emphasize when I talked about that shock a half decade ago, a half dozen years, it was really a half decade ago, it was 2021 season where it really started to happen and impact the numbers in a key way. Quarterback ADOT's falling and all of these things. And then again, Robert Saleh's acknowledging it like 2 off seasons later, because 2022 was the first season where the offensive numbers were incredibly low, which was just on the back of 2020 being, by any metric, the best offensive season in NFL history. Now, there was a weird element in 2020 that there were no fans on the field, and so road teams tended to be a lot better. They weren't dealing with noise, and so that was part of it. But it was also the culmination of increased passing trends that, again, we talk about these ebbs and flows. I always laugh at people that the change in the defenses was talked about as a cover 2 shell, and then you had a bunch of people be like, "Oh, this is not that big of a deal. This is a bubble." Was the way that a lot of people talked about it, and it drove me nuts at the time. I was writing somewhat aggressively about, no, this is not a bubble. This is like a legitimate shock to the system. It's one of the things I'm most proud of in my career, that I was very aware of this early on. This was a meaningful shift league-wide in what was happening, and then have been emphasizing the play caller stuff, especially when we got those quotes from, right when this was starting to happen. Going into 2023, everyone was like, well, offenses will just have their counter punch. And it's like, no, they may not, and they didn't. 2023 was another really bad offensive season. 2022, 2023, really the worst ones. And then we've had some rules changes that have changed the way that we may look at offensive stuff. Scoring was back up in 2025, but yards were down, which gets back to like some of the return rules and the special team stuff that has allowed for better field position. Kickers are getting way better, and so there was a much higher rate of drives that ended in a score last year, which affects the points, which is fun to see. We want to see touchdowns, but if you go look at the yardage, last year was actually a pretty low season for yardage. Now, I would argue that there are teams that are finding that counter punch now, and that stuff was going to come. But the ways that defenses were playing things, as you talked about back in the day, it was stop the run. And fundamentally what Robert Saleh was talking about when he was talking about the jabs and the uppercut was, we want to stop the explosives. We are now focused on working from the deepest part of the field back to the line of scrimmage when we scheme up our defense, as opposed to you have to win in the trenches and then worry about the deep stuff later, which is basically the way that defensive football was played since the advent of the forward pass, because that's the way they used to play it before there was ever even a forward pass, right? It was a game of like rugby scrums, and then the forward pass became this high-risk, high-reward thing for decades where interception rates were really, really high, and then over time, teams understood the value of turnovers. You had the Bill Walsh West Coast offense, which made the short pass, a high-efficiency success rate thing, way more interesting in the 80s and in the 90s, and then as you get into the 2000s, so one of the ebbs and flows thing, I was talking about so that you have the cover 2 thing, and one of the things I loved when that was first coming up in 2021, 2022, this cover 2 shell, people would emphasize, well, the cover 2 rates aren't even up. And I was like, that's not what the cover 2 shell is. The cover 2 shell is about getting more DBs on the field, and then this malleability of pre-snap and post-snap rotations, and I think most people understand that better now in 2026. But it wasn't about sticking in cover 2. That's what Sean McVay talked about in 2023, about defenses becoming unregulated. He was saying he wanted them to be regulated. He wanted them to play perfect cover 2 defense because they had cover 2 beaters in the playbook. You can't call a play for a defense that is malleable from what they show you pre-snap to post-snap because you don't know what you're seeing. He used to famously, when Jared Goff was his quarterback, get them up to the line of scrimmage and tell Goff in the headset what to do based on the coverage, based on what the defense was doing. And he was part of the reason for this. And Patrick Mahomes was part of the reason for this with Tyreek Hill. chucking the ball over everyone's head for long touchdowns that it became untenable for defenses to give up these bombs in an era where the passing games had gotten so evolved. But anyway, the point was people were going, cover 2 is not some new thing. It's been around forever. If you think this is clearly just a bubble. The Tampa 2 was, Tony Dungy saying, I remember that coming up a bunch.
Right.
And I was like, this is not the Tampa 2. This is not what Tony Dungy was doing. This is completely different. It's still
an over-index on, like, there's like a ball knower tendency, I think, to like over-index on what the very specific thing means while losing the forest through the trees a little bit. Where like it's the same thing as like, if you're over-focusing on specifically like the personnel grouping or over-focusing specifically on its cover 2, you're losing what the overall trend is, which is what you're emphasizing, which is a reorientation of defense around taking away explosive pass plays down the field. And if you want to call that the cover 2 for short, like, go for it. But like, and I think it's if you're over-indexing on like, well, actually, the Tony Dungy played the cover 2, and it's like I know that both means this. But like it's a different prioritization and orientation of how the defense is defending. And if you want to explain that in short and slightly imprecise ways or very long and more precise ways, you're still getting at the
for sure
crux of the actual issue, which is that there's a reorientation against explosives.
And this idea of the cover 2 really was the cover 2 shell. And the point of the cover 2 shell was it's a shell look that you can get to so many different defensive looks from, because you kind of have your corners wide and your safeties over the top, and either of them can drop back and be the guy who drops back, and the other can step forward, and you don't have like a clear free safety, strong safety. You may have a third safety on the field or a slot cornerback and your fifth defensive back because you're a nickel, and maybe he ends up dropping and one of the safeties comes up and you still get into a cover 2, but it's different safeties than your pre-snap alignment, whatever. There's all sorts of stuff. There's way more about the defensive stuff than I truly understand. You have the Vic Fangio has been a huge influence on this. Brett Coleman does great YouTube work and had a great YouTube video talking to, I believe it was Coach Vass, and this was like last summer, a good one to look up if you want to know about all of the like calls on defense and what they're doing and how they're doing it and how they're making these decisions in the Fangio scheme. Very, very interesting stuff to me. But the point was that a lot of people were trying to discount this shift as if it wasn't that big of a deal and the offenses were just going to get a counterpunch. And I was trying to say that if it was that simple, not all of the quarterbacks' ADOTs would be shrinking and not have answers. And it's like some offenses would have answers and none of them did. And so now the flip side of this point about the bubble and the way that things shift, how do you identify what's a shock to a legitimate shock, and how do you identify one of the things? One of my favorite other things where I'm on the other side, I'm being the cover 2 Tony Dungy guy, is I love hearing people talk about how quarterbacks are getting under center more because that's helping the run game and it's helping pass efficiency to be under center. That's the next evolution. It's like, that's not the next evolution. That's how they played the sport for 50 years until I don't think people understand that the shotgun formation was a sub package until like the 2010s. When I was an early writer, I would go back to the old Football Outsiders, which unfortunately RIP no longer exists as a site, but they had an article that had a table with data in it about the rate of shotgun usage, league average, and then it was like the top team and the bottom team. And it was each of 5 years. And I believe I want to say it was 2008, 2013, and 2018. I may be off a little bit, but it's sometime from like 2005 to 2015-ish. Because I think I wrote this article in 2017. So I don't know why I would have been using that table with 2018 data. So that, anyway, I can't remember the exact years. But the point is that the rate of shotgun usage in the NFL had climbed a massive amount over a 10-year span. And from the first window that Football Outsiders were showing, the team with the league leading shotgun rate had a lower shotgun rate than you had 5 years and 5 more years. So 10 years later, the last place team, the 32nd place team, if I'm not mistaken, it was something like 35% for the league leader. 10 years later, it was like 40% for the lowest team in the league. And so as far as how I think about what happened in the last half decade and how we got to where we did. When I think about the 2000 to 2010 era, I'm still thinking under center quarterback play, running the ball, stopping the run, Zach Thomas at linebacker. Those guys don't exist anymore. You had the Dick Vermeil, Priest Holmes teams and LaDainian Tomlinson and Sean Alexander, and those guys were great, super fun for fantasy football. And then you started to get more shotgun later in that decade. Drew Brees was doing it a lot with Sean Payton and throwing 600 times and using the short passing game, and Tom Brady was doing it as his offenses started to evolve in his New England era. And then in the early 2010s, you had the Legion of Boom, the Seattle Seahawks defense that famously were basically like, we are going to grab receivers every single time and force the referees to throw flags more than they want to throw flags, so then we'll eventually get away with stuff. They led the league in like defensive pass interference and stuff, but still had the best secondary in the league. They went on and won the 2013 Super Bowl, and then went back to the Super Bowl in 2014. And
pretty similar to the OKC Thunder, to make another basketball analogy, where they like foul you on every single play, and they're like, I dare you to call a foul on every single defensive possession. You're not going to.
Right. It puts a lot on the refs because they're trying to keep the flow of the game going and all these things. After 2014, Dean Blandino, who we all know from TV now, but he was the referee, the head of referees at the time. His memo was on the internet. It's no longer on the internet. I quoted this one in an old article. It was a memo he sent out after 2014 about the increased, about this exact stuff, and they were going to increase the emphasis on illegal contact and defensive holding. Those weren't new penalties, but they were penalties that existed to that point. And then they were deciding that, hey, we're going to start throwing these flags and call these five-yard penalties that we see all the time in the NFL now. For people who don't really understand. But my point is the shotgun trend was already progressing a little bit at that point, but that's when all of this really took off, was 2014. And it's not that long of a timeline if you think about it from that perspective. The passing, if you go look at season by season numbers, the increased passing trends, both volume and like completion percentage and all of those things start really escalating in the 2010s. And then 2020 is sort of the culmination of that. What happens, another thing that happens, because I remember early in my RotoViz years, I can't remember the name of the author of the piece, but we had a guy who had a PhD, I think, from like Northwestern. He did some great stats work, and he had done a piece on weight correlating to fantasy production for wide receivers. And he did it about in 2015, which is when I started working with RotoViz, and I was an editor there at 2016, and I was working with him on some follow-up stuff. And I remember giving him my theory that maybe the reason I think it was that 2015 didn't work out as well with that relationship was this rule change, or this emphasis on defensive holding and illegal contact. You needed weight when the rules were a little bit more defensive back friendly in terms of grabbing and holding and getting in the way of guys. Like you watch the NFL now, you can't stop their progress at all. That used to be a thing as recently as 2013 and the Seahawks won a Super Bowl doing it in 2013. So you have this entirely different meta in the NFL, and since then, and that's ultimately I bring up the weight and wide receiver point, because again, if you remember 2015 and earlier, and you were looking at stats and models built and trying to identify things that correlated to fantasy production and those things at the time, you would have absolutely have seen weight as really relevant for wide receivers. And then you would have seen over the next several years, which is what everyone in the industry saw, that it became less and less important, and it was directing you the wrong way. You had guys like Kelvin Benjamin, who in his rookie season is a big-bodied wide receiver that the Panthers drafted in the first round. His first season had like 9 touchdowns and had a good season, and he went on to a career that was during that era. As that got less and less important, those physicality elements of the position got less important, then teams started prioritizing the athleticism, and those were the things that now won. And defenses started prioritizing defensive backs that were smaller and more athletic and those types of things. Those were the things that won on that side of the ball as well, in a landscape with different emphasis on different rules. And so now we have way more light receivers that are able to actually stay healthy throughout an NFL season and be very productive. And you had guys like Kelvin Benjamin by the end of his career have to change positions to tight end and basically fade out because he didn't have the skills that were then transferable to the changing landscape in the NFL, which you talked about the evolutionary timeline. And that's, I mean, I've talked about this a ton as well, and I always try to emphasize it when I talk about the macro trends. At any given point, like when we're talking about this right now, we are just at a point in a timeline that's going to continue into the future, and the different things that happen tomorrow and next year and the year after are going to create a different meta. This sport is constantly evolving. The rules are changing, and the ways that you can win are always evolving. And it gets back to that McVay quote from this offseason where he says, you always have to adapt and grow and understand what's going to win next year. And that's the same thing we do in fantasy football, by the way, is try to figure out, hey, what's the market doing? What's the landscape doing? How can we win? It's not just about understanding what the sport is doing, but it is very helpful, and that's why we're starting here. In our next shows, Jacob, we're going to start talking a little bit more about fantasy-specific stuff and where we're going, which we're excited to do. But this this whole timeline, again, from late 00s to closer to 2010, you start the increase of shotgun, and you get to these, and you talked about like the Bills and using 10 personnel, which is 4 receivers on the field. Cliff Kingsbury gets hired famously by the Cardinals and talks about how he's going to go 4 wide receiver all the time, and he tried to do it a lot and found that was kind of tough, and he went to more 3 receiver and stuff. But a shotgun spread, more college formations, we saw a lot of that in that time. And because of these changes to the ways that defenses couldn't stop receivers from running and couldn't impede them in those things, you had a lot lighter receivers able to just run free. And we saw passing offense get much, much better all the way through that 2020 season that I said by any metric you want to look at. It's the best season, offensive season in NFL history. And then 2021 is when you see the shock, when you see defenses start to say, look, we're just going to put more DBs on the field. We're going to take away the deep stuff. And even though we've always thought that we wanted to stop the run and be tough guys, we're going to let you run efficiently. And then you see in 2021, so that was midway 2021, 2022 and 2023, really poor offensive seasons. You see offenses trying different things. So what I wrote about at the time was in 2022, it was shocking to me. The Falcons and the Bears were among the most run-heavy offenses in decades. They had more rush attempts. Whichever team had because that was the Arthur Smith Falcons. I think the Bears had even more. Whichever one had more rush attempts since like the 1990 Raiders that had like Bo Jackson and Marcus Allen on this team, like the Tecmo Super Bowl Raiders. It was decades before even the Dick Vermeil and Sean Alexander era I was talking about, or a decade before that, but decades before where we were. We're in 2022, and the arc of this sport has always trended toward more passing. It's not all ebbs and flows. Some of these things are always moving one direction, even though there are some changes along that timeline. We are moving toward more passing. So for there to be more run-heavy offenses in 2022 than anything since 1990 was absurd. And yet the exact same year, the Bucs and Chargers were among the most pass-heavy offenses in the last 20 years or 30 years because their answers to what defenses were doing, and this gets back to this unregulated versus regulated thing, the way that I've talked about it a lot with what defenses did and what the shock was, is they prioritized what they wanted to do more. I think defenses in the past, and we get back to this conversation that we're having about the tight ends and matching, because what defenses started to do in 2021, 2022, 2023 was not let the offense dictate what they were going to do. They were going to call things that were more malleable and be able to shift to what the offense wanted to do. And so then the offense they're like, okay, well, Arthur Smith famously in 2022 was like, if you're going to give me run looks, I'll just run every single time. And that's why the Falcons had so many rushes that year. Bucs and Chargers, that was the Tom Brady Bucs. And then I believe an early career Justin Herbert season we're going to throw every single time. We'll just throw short passes. Like Herbert's like, I'll throw to Eckler every time. And Tom Brady's ADOT was really, really low, and he's just throwing really short passes to his running backs and to Chris Godwin and all these guys. And Gronk was on the team, I believe, at that time. And so you had, in the same season, teams shifting at the bottom end of the spectrum toward among the most run-heavy offense in decades and among the most pass-heavy offense in decades. And the statistical improbability of that is what gets back to this point of that being a legitimate shock to the system and not just your consistent ebb and flow where one team is doing. Same thing with the declining ADOTs, which is when I first started talking about in 2021 and stealing signals, where you had not just a couple quarterbacks, but like 12 of the whatever it was, like 18 quarterbacks that weren't injured around that time that were, started each of these like 8 or 10 week span I was looking at, where their ADOTs just suddenly fell off the cliff, like sort of in the same spot around like week 6 or 7. Oh God, we've done it twice now, 6, 7. But you had all of the offenses starting to see defensive looks that were forcing them to throw underneath more, all sort of at the same time. And we know it's a copycat league, and I don't know who started that, whether it was Vic Fangio or whoever, but you had a lot of defenses clearly starting to do things the same and take away the vertical stuff, take away the deep stuff. Famously, Josh Allen was part of that equation. I remember they lost to a bad Jaguars team on the road that year because Allen couldn't get anything down the field, and they had like a horrible offensive game. And then the way that Bills offense has evolved since has been Allen's gotten a lot better at short passing. Early in his career, that was a high ADOT quarterback who would chuck it deep and was thought to be inaccurate in the short area of the field. He worked really hard on his mechanics to develop his short area accuracy, and he's gotten a lot better at it. And their whole offense is about like short passing these days. But
that's also gone from one of the
offense.
most pass-happy offenses in the league when Allen had his first breakout to now being one of the most run-heavy offenses in the league too. And they're a team that uses like a dedicated 6th offensive lineman a lot. So it's been a complete change in identity for that team.
And so that was through. I'm doing this whole run up. That was through 2023. And I'm talking about it league wide, but this is a great point about the Bills that you're making. That like and it's important to remember whenever we talk about league wide trends that we have 32 teams. We have a sample of 32 teams. When you get into one of the other reasons that there's these different eras and an evolutionary thing is like after the Seahawks had all that success, all of the defensive, the next several years, everyone wanted to do cover 3 because that's what the Seahawks did. But they didn't have Earl Thomas as a sideline-to-sideline safety to make that work. And so you had Gus Bradley and Dan Quinn getting these jobs at other places, and their defenses kind of sucked without the same Seahawks personnel, which gets back to the same point we're making about offenses today, having the personnel to do the tight end stuff. And you have a lot. So then suddenly you have like 5 or 6, and that's a good chunk of the league, defenses shifting toward a type of defense that probably isn't the optimal defense. And then we're playing shotgun and we're attacking the seams against your cover 3, and you don't have safeties that can actually defend that as well as the Seahawks did. And suddenly the cover 3 pass defenses were one of the reasons that pass offenses got so good in the 2010s. At any rate, 2022, 2023 are bad offensive seasons. I think in 2024 and especially in 2025, we've started to see some improvements, especially at the top. But what's important to be noted as we talk about this tight end shift and we talk about the different things that are happening, it's still within this realm of defenses taking away explosives. And the defenses are evolving too. One of the big things that we saw last year, which is for me an additional understanding of what defenses are doing in 2025 as opposed to even 2022 or 2023, was that they're doing a lot more with the stand-up defensive fronts, the muddle fronts or whatever, the stunts and things. I remember seeing Nate Tice talk about how the protection, the full slide protection things, and some of the protection shifts that the offense will try to do were getting hammered last year. So there's some defensive and offensive line things. I think that's probably a part of the reason why we saw so many rookie running backs not play as much in pass protection was probably a big element. Like you had Travion Henderson was supposed to be a good pass protector, and he has a really rough first year in that regard. But guys like RJ Harvey, who we kind of knew weren't going to be good at pass protecting, certainly weren't playing a lot.
There's even a lot on my team, the Colts, like Giddens went from the clear RB2 to a healthy inactive because he couldn't handle the pass pro, and they went out and they got Amir Abdullah, who's like obviously not a dynamic player, but could handle that veteran leadership in the pass protection game.
Yeah, and one of the things I wrote this offseason was a piece called I wonder if the paths for rookies are more complicated or something like that, because as we move, one of the big thing I think the multi-tight end sets is doing, and I'll be interested with you as we get into the what's going to happen next element of this, because 2024, 2025, we start to see defenses continue to evolve, but we see offenses making improvements, and you talk through the multi-tight end sets, getting defenses into base, then throwing out of that, taking advantage of that. But the big thing is, as you talked about, if the defense does what the Seahawks do when they go into nickel, what do you do offensively? You're not going to want to just run tight ends and routes against a nickel defense. Are you going to just run the ball forever? Or do you want to get your wide receivers back on the field at that point? Because they're going to be more likely to win on the routes because they're the better receivers than tight ends in terms of that stuff. And one of the other really fascinating things right now that gets back to this whole idea of there has been a shock in the last half decade is we have 20 new offensive coordinators this year, I think it is, and they are all young. The league doesn't care about your knowledge of scheme from before 2020. They don't care, or 2015 or whatever. You have a coaching resume that's 3 decades long. The league does not care right now. They are hiring guys that were backup quarterbacks 2 years ago on NFL rosters. David Blau and Sean Mannion. These guys are getting offensive coordinator jobs in a way that's... We've trended toward younger coaches in the league for a while now, but it's never been this dramatic. And I think that also gets back to this point of we are in a different landscape, a post-2021 or a post-2020 shock landscape, and it makes the shotgun formations more difficult, for example, which is why we're just shifting back to under center. That whole spiel is me getting to this point of people saying under center is the new evolution, and I kind of feel like the boomer, and I'm like, did you guys watch football 15 years ago, 20 years ago? Because that's all the sport used to be. It's not like some new evolution. If anything, we just found out that shotgun formations as a dominant offensive system were short-lived, and we're going to have... That was the evolution, and then it got... That was the bubble that popped, was shotgun formations, spread formations. We got a decade of that, basically, and then it's gone. Or it's not entirely gone. There's still a lot of shotgun in the league, but we're moving back away from that for the reasons that shotgun wasn't a big deal in the 1980s and the 1990s, even though it was a formation that existed in the 1990s. There were the Warren Moon Colts did a bunch.
Shoot. The run and shoot.
Yeah. There was a bunch of... there's examples of it, but it was not super popular because... There's advantages to being under center and those types of things. So that is one of the ones for me that is a ebb and flow element. But anyway, I did the whole 20-year spiel there, and I apologize for Jacob for going for so long. But
maybe I'll try and
jump in.
I'll put a question to you and try and recap some of what you were saying there. So I think the biggest curiosity point for me is like we talked about this 20-year evolution. And like from my standpoint, and again, I always keep thinking about how this aligns with other sports, because I think that both baseball, especially, and basketball have both been faster to adopt to some of the ways that we can incorporate analytics and just high-level North Star decision-making into the game than football has been. And so I'm always trying to keep an eye on lessons from that. You look back to the mid-2000s, I feel like neither side of the ball was particularly well optimized, because you had both sides of the ball. I thought that the majority of offenses were oriented around running the ball, and defenses were oriented around stopping the run at a period of time in which...
You mean like 2005-ish?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
In which it was like demonstrably true that at least within that world, like passing the ball is way more efficient than running the ball. And in large part, it probably was because both teams were optimizing around the run. And I think it was the offensive play callers who were the first ones to evolve. They were as a group, it's never universal, but as a group, the offensive play callers were the first ones to, I think, try and figure out where the point of diminishing returns was on the pass, right? You talked about the shotgun formations as a bubble. I view it similarly as that point of diminishing returns, where they were like, how far can we just press passing it until we start to see the efficiency drop? And the defenses were slower to react. They obviously have reacted, and we've talked about how. My question, and I certainly don't know the answer, is like, I talked about in my piece, and I've talked about it a lot in various writing, is the concept of the Nash equilibrium, which if folks want to go watch, like A Beautiful Mind, for a deeper dive. But basically, it's a game theory concept of when two players are both more or less taking the optimal path relative to one another, that there's no further counter moves available. And where is that in football? And I guess the question is, like, are we closing in on it? Because I don't think that, like, the specifics of, we're going to run 13 personnel and pass out of it. I don't think that's the end of the evolution. But, like, the broader trends, you look at now, for the first time, the EPA per rush, the EPA per pass are converging. It's almost the same now. Overall, passing remains more efficient than running, but the gap is way smaller than it used to be. There are some teams for which they're actually able to run the ball more efficiently than pass the ball. Like, what is that Nash equilibrium endpoint? Does it exist? And if it exists, is it defenses just allow you to run the ball and offenses just run the ball constantly because that's the only thing they can do efficiently against these defenses? Or is it teams go back to passing the ball more with an acceptance of we're never going to be able to pass the ball as efficiently as we used to when defenses were poorly optimized to stop it? Like, is that a different answer for different teams? Or is there something that's completely different altogether that offenses can access? Because I guess I'm a little bit of the mindset of like, okay, there's always going to be moves and counter moves. There's always going to be smart iterations. But are we veering towards a point where now that I think both offenses and defenses are more correctly optimizing around explosive plays in a way that they never really used to, if they're both optimizing around that North Star, are we moving to a spot where just we're never really going to get back to the offensive efficiency that we were in like a 2019, a 2020? Because that's kind of my lean, is that like I think now that equilibrium is both of those teams, both offense being like we'd really like to be explosive, the defense is being like we're going to do everything possible to make you not explosive. And is this 13 personnel explosive passing stuff kind of a dead cat bounce that is just eventually going to lead to offenses having to decide either we're going to have to just throw into extremely disadvantageous environments and live with it, or we're going to have to run the ball way more than we want to. And depending on your personnel and your strengths, who your quarterback is, who your receivers are, running back, etc., choosing one of those two paths, and that could create like a very, very interesting fantasy environment where some teams, unless you're investing in their running back, or maybe their wide receiver one, become pretty difficult and inhospitable environments for fantasy, because the only way they can maintain reasonable offense in this world is to just run the ball repeatedly. Because if you don't have a quarterback who's able to throw on hard mode, then you might just be better off, taking the increase in rush efficiency that defenses are letting you have and just grinding through that way. I mean, you think of the Panthers. We talked about T-Mac at the beginning of the show. They're a team that I think realized that, like, we do not have the horses to throw the ball on hard mode because Bryce Young sucks. And we have, one wide receiver we really trust. And so our best path forward to win games is to run the ball as much as humanly possible and play slow. And the defense is going to let us do that to an extent. And we're going to try and win on the margins of some really close games. And if you are the Bengals or the Cowboys or the Chiefs, when you have a quarterback who's capable of performing more in more adverse situations, you probably come to a different conclusion. And you probably come to the conclusion of, hey, we should certainly, it's better to run the ball well than run the ball poorly. And we're going to keep that as a part of our team. But like when push comes to shove, even if the defense is making it as difficult as possible to throw, we believe that we have, the quarterback and the pass catchers, especially for the case of a team like Cincinnati or Dallas, to just grind our way through it. And we're going to throw anyway, and we're going to throw less successfully than maybe we would have 5 years ago, but that's still going to be the best path. I think different teams are going to come to different conclusions, but I don't know that any of those conclusions are going to be as successful as the apex of what teams were able to do a half decade ago. And I'm not entirely sure that that's even going to be possible, because you look at, again, other sports, like there are just new equilibriums. Like in the NBA, there will never be, I don't think, another era of basketball, barring a rule change, in which the NBA Finals is decided on an 83-79 game, which is what it was decided on 15 years ago. Because now teams have realized like we can shoot threes, and there's defensive counters to that, but there's not really a defensive counter that will ever make NBA offenses average 90 points a game again, because the light bulb went on and everyone realized 3 is worth more than 2 actually. And I think it's basically the same light bulb moment for the NFL, where everyone realized explosive plays are more damaging to us than 3-yard runs. But it's gone the opposite way, where it's defenses that seem to have walked away from this newfound understanding with a more systemic advantage than offenses have, which is really interesting, and it makes the sport, I think, pretty unique.
The way you started talking about that was asking me, and it's a great way for people who have listen to me do the whole spiel I just did about the last 20 years on stealing bananas or in my writing so many times, and they're like, and it's been building every year since 2021, and my understanding of it changes slightly, but they're like, man, why do you constantly talk about this? You did such a great job of crystallizing sort of what my point is, which is exactly what you just said. It's never going to go back. That's what evolution is. And it's exactly what you just described with the NBA. You asked what the equilibrium was, and when you were talking about like the 2018 era, like pre-shock to the, defenses changing the way they're doing it, you were like, teams are just passing more and more and trying to find where the end point was. My answer would be the equilibrium was different before the shock and after the shock would be my first answer. And before the shock, it's kind of hard to remember, but the overwhelming like analytical perspective at the time, because analytics were still like the outsiders thing, was that every team should be throwing way more. I don't know where the equilibrium is, but we're nowhere near it. Teams run way too much. They're all boomers. My buddy Josh Hermsmeyer would always tweet about this and catch a lot of flack for being a know-it-all or presenting it that way. Ben Baldwin would often get that, and another. I don't know if I'd call him a buddy, but we followed each other for a lot of years, and I've talked to him, and I think highly of both of those guys. A lot of people don't. A lot of people think that they're very arrogant or whatever. Kevin Cole, got a chance to work with him at RotoViz as editors in 2016. Another one, and those guys were, I think, correct in the landscape that we were in. The way that I described the shock and why it's so different, it's not just that defenses were like, oh, we're going to take away explosives, or we're going to make explosives the first order thing and then work back to the line of scrimmage. The way that when I had the aha moment was that everyone in the analytics community was saying we need to pass more. Passing is way more efficiency than running. And it was defenses that realized that passing is more efficient than running. That's what we need to prioritize. That's what we need to optimize to stop. And I was like, man, in like 2022 or 2023, I wrote about this in the newsletter a bunch. I was like, man, how did I not see that coming? Why would I have not? I felt like I understood all the things.
Right. It's like everyone ascribed all this agency to offenses without forgetting that defenses also get to make choices.
Why would you not think that the defenses at some point would be like, hey, we're going to prioritize passing as well? Offenses can call more passes, but you're telling me they're idiots because they won't pass as much as they should, and every team should be passing more, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe we should stop the pass as a first order priority instead of employing these. I made the Zach Thomas comment before, but it's even the type of person. I talk about the versatile personnel and stuff. It used to be we need a middle linebacker that can fill the run fit and fill those gaps. Those guys don't even exist anymore unless they can pass protect and cover the field. It's not downhill linebackers that go stop the run. You need to be able to stop the pass, and then hopefully you can also fit the run, right? Like that's what we're hoping for our linebackers, is they can also do that stuff, and then they're pretty exciting players. So the pre-shock equilibrium was clearly we need to throw more. The post-shock equilibrium has shifted because the defenses are now prioritizing stopping the pass, and it's what you said now. And my answer is we're a lot closer to the equilibrium. Now it's individual teams are going to land on that spectrum in individual spaces. I do think originally, and that's what we saw in that 2023 or 2022 year, which is so important, is like you had some teams like, oh, we're going to run every single time, and some teams like, we're going to throw every single time. Even if it's short passes, and you see the ADOT come down, and people have hammered Patrick Mahomes for his per attempt efficiency, and I always talk about how and his ADOT coming down, I always talk about you have to look at the volume of dropbacks. You can't compare that to a guy who's dropping back 100 times less, because he's only dropping that back, or a higher rate of his dropbacks are in obvious pass or non-obvious pass situations, whereas Mahomes is dropping back against these obvious pass defenses and then taking the underneath over and over and over, which is what Tom Brady did that year for the Bucs. And I mean, it's what the team was deciding. I want Tom Brady to have the decision every single time, whether he's going to push vertically or throw underneath. That's the best version of our offense, is the ball in Tom Brady's hands. That's what you described with the Bengals or the Cowboys and how they may handle things with Joe Burrow and Dak Prescott. Some of these offenses need to be willing to throw into defensive looks that 5 years ago or 7 years ago would have been a clear run look. And I think some of the teams immediately did say, okay, we'll just run. And last year, it was funny, the pass rate over expecteds league-wide shifted toward the negative. And I've commented in some of my writing, maybe we need to rethink the expected pass rate, because that stat
there were
was
only
developed.
8 teams out of 32 last year that were above 0, I believe.
Yeah, so you have three-quarters of the league at a negative pass rate over expected. So obviously our expected pass rate needs to be recalibrated to some degree. in this landscape, or maybe that's just the offense is really pushing the envelope right now, but then we're going to work back from that. I do think that makes sense, where like defenses are giving you the run, and so one of the things we haven't talked about is why this makes sense. It's because the per attempt efficiency is so much higher for passing, and then it's not just explosives, but it's even if you get like 10-yard gains in the passing game, you're getting a first down, right? And so it's when you let teams run, even if they run what's efficiently, which is like 4 yards per carry is about average. If they average 4.5 yards per carry, they got a 3rd and 1, right? Or if they get a 5-yard carry, then you can hold them to 3, they got a 3rd and 2. The idea is get them into 3rd downs, and then maybe you stuff them on that 3rd down, or their quarterback slips.
Maybe they convert 3 first downs in a row, but the next time they have a holding penalty, and now it's 1st and 20. You have them
exactly. You
situation.
get a sack when they drop back to throw, or they have to throw on a 3rd and 6 because you did stop the 1st and 10 run that time, and then they throw on a 3rd and 6 and they get a drop, or any of these types of things. Put them in the situation where the one play can stop their drive, as opposed to chunk gain, score, which is a little bit about that explosive versus like success rate orientation. Even if you let teams run effectively, they have to be in 3rd down more, basically, to sustain these drives. Now, what I think we're seeing as teams went to the run more is we're seeing, and then the success rate of drives, the percentage of drives that ended in a score last year was at 2020 levels. Scoring was back up, yardage was down, but the percentage of drives ended, and so the number of drives is coming down because the plays per drive and teams are staying on the field and they're running the ball and they're running clock. And so we're seeing plays come down and drives come down pretty meaningfully the last couple of years. And that affects fantasy football. Now, when you talk about the 32 different teams and what this is in terms of actionability for 2026 and beyond, the way you were posing it is absolutely how I'm thinking about it, which is some teams are basically going to be disasters for fantasy football because we are not going to go back to where defenses are going to do things differently. And if some of these offenses basically don't have answers and their only answer is to run way too much, get back to the Raiders and how they were throwing fewer than 100 air yards in so many of those games. Now, the Raiders wound up the very worst offense in the league last year in terms of yards, in terms of points, in several categories, all the rushing categories, rushing yards per carry, rushing touchdowns. They were awful. They were very, very, very awful. They're not the only way that this can go, but you also get this deconcentration. And we talk about concentration in fantasy football. The tight end thing, what people have emphasized, I do think in a good way, is that you're not going to see teams run the multi-tight end or heavy personnel 75% of the time. Even when the Rams are doing it a lot, it's like 40, 50%. They're still getting into 11 personnel a lot as well, which is 3 receivers on the field as opposed to, and then 1 running back and 1 tight end. You have 5 eligibles. The numbers relate to, the first number is the number of running backs on the field. The second number is the number of tight ends. So 12 is 1 running back, 2 tight ends. 13 is 1 running back, 3 tight ends. And you have 5 total. And so the number that's not listed is wide receivers. So 12 leaves 2 receivers. 13 leaves 1 receiver. For anyone who doesn't know the personnel nomenclature, but that's the way that goes. 11 personnel is 1 running back, 1 tight end, 3 receivers. It's the most common formation. And you see that a lot. You're still going to see it a lot, even as there's more tight ends. But the way that I've been thinking about the increased use of 12 and 13 personnel is more sub packages generally, which there are players that are going to play in every package. And so it does make the wide receivers, like you talked about JSN for Seattle last year, who's playing in 12 and 13 and getting an advantage in those formations because he's running routes against fewer wide receivers, which we know to be an advantage in yards per out run and those types of stats. And then he's also staying out there in 11, and he's still the clear number 1 in those formations as well. But what you're seeing on a team like that is there's no secondary receiver that even matters. Cooper Kupp was like not very good. Marcus Valdes-Scantling was their number 3 early. We had Torrey Horton had a few touchdowns. I don't think if people think he was as good as or better than he actually was. If you go back, I think he had 5 TDs. He had like 13 catches and 5 touchdowns. So people are like, oh, Torrey Horton was kind of hitting. He had 13 receptions last year. Like, he was not hitting. The tight ends, AJ Barner had some touchdowns and ran hot on TDs, and so people think he did a lot more than he did. But if you go look at his receptions and his usage, it's not that impressive, and he's probably somebody who's going to regress this year. It's a rotational aspect. essentially the heavier tight end personnel answer is that we are close to equilibrium, and now it's more about scheme. Now it's more about the chess match, getting them into base. I wrote a piece earlier this offseason called Scheme is More Important Than Ever. I think we are at this point, this is why they brought in all these young OCs, is they want, I think what the Rams wanted to do, and especially as you talk about a longer season, 17-game season, they wanted to be able to have multiple different sort of base offenses that they could go to at different times. When Puka got banged up, that's when they started using 13 more, and they used Adams as the one receiver, and people were like, oh, this is hurting Puka Nakua's value. It wasn't about that. It was about Puka Nakua not being 100% healthy, and the Rams being like, this is a 17-game season. When Nakua's out there, we'll use him a bunch, but we're basically finding success in a different base, in a different type of offense. They used to be the most 11 personnel heavy team in the league. And Sean McVay would make everything look similar in 11 personnel, and then it would be slight variations of the concepts. It's different now. He wants to have multiple different base formations and rotate guys. It's what the Bills have been doing for a few years. It's what Sean Payton loves to do. And it's one of the reasons that I think he's one of the boomer coaches that still has success, because I argue the league moved back toward him. What he was already doing with the Saints is what works optimally now. Not every coach's scheme and system makes sense in the modern NFL, but Sean Payton loved to do that kind of stuff years ago. And so he's the one that's sort of fortunate that the trends and everything worked back to like, oh, he already has a whole system where he implements a variety of different personnel packages and likes to use guys in situational ways and knows how to coach that, install that, and teach that all offseason, build his offense that way, and have his position coaches on, and there's a whole thing that comes with that, and that's going to work for him in the modern NFL. It's not going to work for guys who do strictly 11 personnel form, stuff, but when you're as sharp as a guy like McVay, you can evolve, and you can have 13 personnel that you use for 3 or 4 weeks, and then their numbers dropped off a little bit again, even going into the postseason. They didn't think 13 personnel was their very best offensive situation. It was an answer to a separate problem. And it gets back to this idea of how like projections in football are very challenging because it's a moving target. It's every NFL season is an evolution. We talk about it with rookies and young players seeing more volume as the season goes along. But the offenses are going to evolve too, and the good ones understand that in the modern NFL. And to your point, when you talk about it team by team, some of these teams are going to be bad for fantasy. There's teams that I went in and projected, and I'm like, I don't want to make any bets here. Someone's going to win, but the risk-adjusted bets here are really challenging for me. I do think there's going to be a good example of that is the Jaguars. And maybe you can make the bet on the running back there on Bashal Tutin, and I do like that bet. But last year, they went into the season with Brian Thomas and Travis Hunter as the guys that were like, hey, this guy's going in the 1-2 turn, the other one's going in the 4-5 range. And they're the studs. They're the 2 recent first-round draft pick wide receivers and Longview guys, right? And by mid-season, one of them's hurt. The other one's not clicking with their quarterback. He had his breakout with Mac Jones and Brian Thomas, and he's no longer clicking with Trevor Lawrence, or maybe never did click with Trevor Lawrence. They've traded for Jakobi Meyers, and Parker Washington, a 4th dude who was on the roster all along, winds up having the 3rd best yards per route run from the point of the Jakobi Meyers trade after week 9 until the end of the postseason. That's not like a stat with a lot of qualifiers there. Literally after week 9 until, including the postseason, until the end of the year, the only 2 players that had a better yards per route run than Parker Washington were Jackson Smith and Jigba and Puka Nakua. And this is on a team that we were talking about Brian Thomas and Travis Hunter. And then you tell me they traded for Jakobi Meyers, and I would be talking about Jakobi Meyers and Brenton Strange as the tight end. They went out and drafted a new blocking tight end and a great receiving tight end. So if Strange goes down, they can still go to 12 personnel and they can do some things. They're going to have some 13 personnel with all those guys out there. Koziel, Borkercher, and Strange. I think Koziel he's probably not going to do a lot, but he's 6'6" and he's super athletic, and they've talked about liking him in the red zone. I think he's a bummer for Strange. If you like Strange will run a lot of routes. Koziel might catch 3 or 4 touchdowns, and like Strange may only be in line to catch 5 or 6, and he may catch 2 as a result of Koziel. That's one outcome, but that, if Koziel runs hot in a red zone role, that's going to be tough for Strange. He may take some of those routes, and so this sub package and situational usage, and the reason you would do something like that is in the modern NFL with an advanced starting field position where the scoring percent per drive is elevated, the difference between getting 3 and 7 on any drive is massive. That's what the game becomes a little bit. Getting into field goal range, kicking a field goal is one thing, but converting the touchdown is the other. And so now it gets down to when the field shrinks and the offense or the defense can actually take DBs off the field. They don't have to worry about explosives. The back of the end zone becomes their umbrella over the top of the deep routes. How can you score? How do you have the situational sub-package usage in those ways? And that's, again, something Sean Payton's done for years, and it's been frustrating, is secondary tight ends scoring touchdowns and using different running backs in the red zone, and it's always tilted me in fantasy, and I think it's going to tilt a lot of people in a lot of different offenses this year. Again, the Bills did some of this last year. Different teams. Dalton Kincaid had great per route numbers, but the excitement about that would be if his routes are going to spike. They're not going to, dude.
I don't see a reason why they should. I mean, there's a misalignment in a big way that you're hitting on between like what is good for some of these teams and what is good for fantasy, and it's like you mentioned the Jaguars. I'm in the middle of I had mentioned I'd written one up on the Bears. I'm doing this ambiguous receiver rooms series, and I'm like about 90% done my Jaguars one, and I'm like. I'm not even 100% sure I'm closer to the answer 6,000 words in on like from any level of certainty, but like it's a fascinating team. The other team I find that's really fascinating from this standpoint of sub packages and difficult to decipher is the Chargers, who I've had the hardest time with all offseason because I'm really optimistic about this offense. I think it's going to be good. I'm a huge fan of Herbert. I'm a huge fan of McDaniel, and all the individual prices I'm having difficulty with because I mean, you want to talk about sub packages. They currently have 4 receivers, 3 tight ends, 3 running backs, and a fullback that I expect will see snaps on a fairly regular basis in their
probably
games.
More.
But like
they may use even additional receivers. Yeah,
maybe even more. But like I can clearly envision a offensive role, and maybe it's not a very productive box score offensive role, but like a legitimate will see the field role for each of Ladd, QJ, Harris, Brennan Thompson, the rookie that they drafted, who is, I think, an interesting deep threat. They're 3 tight ends in Kohler and Gadsden and Njoku, and all 3 of the running backs with Hampton and Keaton and Vidal, and then the fullback, Ingold, who's not going to have any production, but is probably going to play, and he's going to eat snaps from somebody and take someone off the field. And like, what do we do with that? It's a crazy team in fantasy where I could see a world where they're a top 5 offense in the NFL this year, but they might still have multiple players who are big losers at cost because, if someone like Ladd, but maybe it's not Ladd, is a guy that plays in all these different personnel packages and he's benefiting from guys like Ingold and Kolar eating up a lot of routes, that could be a huge win for him. But what if they decide it's not? What if it's Trey Harris is out there playing in 13 personnel again, but then he's not a big focus of the team in 11? And it's going to be an interesting team to monitor week to week.
And this exact point is why your buddy Ryan Heath that you do the Dynasty Points podcast with made the Ladd to sort of JSN, like somewhat comparison of and I'm not trying to put like words in his mouth because I don't think he thinks he's going to be JSN necessarily, but this idea that if Ladd's out there running routes in more 12 and 13 personnel with more tight ends on the field, that would be very good for him in the way that part of JSN's breakout could be described to have been somewhat similar to that. I've talked about this idea of the 60-40 rule a little bit in my writing this offseason, which is that for most models that are built in football, as people try to predict stuff, a lot of the stuff that we're talking about today is why those models can't get to like an R-squared of 80% or 90% or anything like that unless you use really simple stats. Like you can say yards predict, fantasy points, but like literally they are the points, right? Like the yards, like touchdowns predict fantasy points pretty well too because they actually are fantasy points. We give a fantasy point a number for that, but a lot of the like advanced models and things that people try to do for fantasy and otherwise in trying to predict like what's happening with the NFL, there tends to be a lower R-squared, and anything beyond that number, like if a 0.6 R-squared means 60% of what you're trying to predict can be explained by the factors that you're looking at. 40% is called unexplained variance, and I call this the 60-40 rule, where we spend a lot of time talking about the 60% in fantasy, but the 40% unexplained variance is really the thing that drives these outlier hits that we're looking for. And so like when you talk about Ladd McConkey versus JSN going into last year, I see a huge difference in everything you just described about the Chargers, and that's the 40% unexplained variance stuff that ends up happening. I can see a lot of optimism for a Ladd McConkey and his profile, but JSN did not have that type of team situation and sub-package, like clear sub-package usage, like on the horizon in a way that isn't clear in how it'll impact McConkey. There's a lot more risk there. And just look what they did last year. The point I was trying to make with the Jaguars, they came into the year with one option at wide receiver as their main focal points, and then there was different dudes at different points in the year that were like their main focal points. Brenton Strange was hurt for a bit, then he had a nice stretch helping out at tight end. Last year, Quentin Johnston was a stud to start the year. His first 4 or 5 weeks, he had massive numbers. By the end of the season, he was doing basically nothing, and I don't think that gets talked about enough with him specifically. Now, I do think McDaniel is likely to use Johnson in some different ways, but the notes that I have on Johnson, I'm just pulling them up real quick. He started the season with 70-plus yards in each of his first 4 games and 4 TDs in that span. And one of the things we've often done in fantasy over the years is this idea of what's called the primacy effect, where the first month the production sticks out in your mind more. The first in a series of things sticks in your mind more. And we do that with fantasy. Quentin Johnston's a hit in 2025 because he had that start, 70-plus yards, 4 games in a row, and 4 TDs. From that point forward across 11 games, he went for more than 53 yards twice. He had 30 or fewer yards 6 times, and he had 4 more total TDs across 11 games after having 1 per game in the first 4 on average. That's a great example of them prioritizing him in the early part of the season when their line was healthy, then their line gets hurt, and people have talked about the Joe Alt effect, and I understand that, but that's the point about these sub packages and these different ways that teams are going to do things. They started to do a little bit more with the tight ends last year, and that's part of why they went out and got more tight ends, so they have the ability to do that again this year if they have offensive line injuries and the things that do happen. And then what ended up happening is in 13 personnel, they were using Trey Harris. That's the sub package that they wanted to go with. They were using their one wide receiver was Trey Harris, and that's a guy going into year 2 that they really like as well. And so how that affects McConkey, how that affects Quentin Johnston, how that affects any of those guys, as you were talking about, is very challenging to predict, not just for week 1 or week 4 or that first month or whatever decision people are going to make when they declare winners for fantasy 3 or 4 weeks in, because everyone does that every year. It's going to be different in week 8. It's going to be different in week 12. And those are the offenses that you kind of don't want to avoid. I mean, I guess if you get it right in the first month and you're in a league with active trades, you can maybe make trades and get out from under these guys because you're afraid that the offense may shift and be malleable. But I expect that from the Jaguars with the depth they acquired and their ability to go 3 tight end or 4 receiver. I expect that with the Chargers for the reasons you said, including the Alec Ingold thing, which Mike McDaniel was apparently hugely supportive of. He really wanted Ingold, who he had in Miami, to be a part of the offense with the Chargers, which, as you said, he's going to take snaps from somebody else. There's only 5 active or eligible players on a given play. If he's out there with a running back and a tight end, you only have 2 receivers. It might be 2 tight ends. It might be in some heavy formations at times. And if they're doing that kind of stuff in the red zone, I mean, who's the one wide receiver, right? Because now you're starting to affect our touchdown rates that are so important. Johnston, big athletic receiver, maybe prioritize in those scenarios, and I know there's people that are fans of him. And Mike McDaniel, the way I think of him is he's the guy that's always used that line that I love to reference, which is think players, not plays. He famously likes to think players when he devises things offensively. I do think they're going to be way less concentrated than they ever were in Miami. I'm not saying it's going to be like Miami when he would just dial everything up to individual players, but I do think there's situations where I could see him thinking, hey, Quentin Johnston's athleticism is something that size, speed, is something I want to utilize. And so maybe I was pretty out on Johnston early in the offseason. I've come around on him quite a bit because I do think that McDaniel is going to find answers for him. But it is a situation that is pretty tricky in LA, as you said. And there's probably going to be winners because this is going to be a good offense, man. I like playing the running backs, both Amari and Hampton and Keaton Mitchell. McDaniel has talked about wanting to get Justin Herbert to get the ball out a little quicker, and they've talked about changing his mechanics a little bit even to get the ball out quicker. Just something he did a lot in Miami with Tua, and they used not just for the running backs. Devon Achane was the big answer for that the most recent seasons, but they did it with Jonnu Smith a couple of years ago famously and other guys to get the ball into the hands of. They did it with Tyreek Hill a decent amount to get the ball into playmakers' hands, quick passes. And they use motion, they use different things to get these guys into space near the line of scrimmage, and then they throw it to them quickly. But I do think, because they really wanted to get Keaton Mitchell, I do think that's one of the things that when I did the ETR podcast so far, I've had the biggest discrepancy where I'm probably out on the biggest limb in my projections. I think Keaton Mitchell is going to get a lot of targets. I think they're going to use him in the passing game because he's a smaller, super fast dude McDaniel wanted, and he likes to devise stuff to get that kind of a player into space in the quick passing game. A la Achane, right, is a guy that's been a very common comparison, obviously, under McDaniel, that Keaton Mitchell's the speedster. But I do think they're still going to throw to Amari and Hampton a ton as well. I think they're going to use the running backs both. And so those are the two guys that I like betting on in that. And I have a hard time drafting any of the other guys other than playing it cheap. So I'm okay playing Trey Harris. And I'm okay when I do Jacksonville playing Travis Hunter if you want to play that way, right? But I have a hard time paying for Brian Thomas right now. I have a hard time paying for Quentin Johnston where he's going and those guys in these offenses, even if I think they're going to be good offenses, which I do on those teams. Now, another team we talked about that's doing the heavy tight end stuff is the Bears, and I told you before the show, I think they are a team that's going to wind up pretty concentrated, actually, and I didn't really expect that coming in.
I think that just the roster that they have, I think that the way that they're going to do some of the heavy personnel stuff, I think is more clearly beneficial to the players that we're betting on than it is for Jacksonville and the Chargers, just because they have so many fewer guys, right? And so I think with the Bears, it's exciting when you think about their offense, and like I project their most common personnel formation to probably be 12 with Kmet, Loveland, Burden, Adunze, and they're going to get into 11 personnel looks where they rotate in guys like Raymond or Walker or the rookie Xavier Thomas. They'll get into some 13 personnel looks to get Roush in there. But to me, it's very clear they have three guys that they probably want to get the ball in the hands of, and people will disagree on the hierarchy of those guys. I think we see it more similarly than differently. And then they kind of have a bunch of other guys who are going to get snaps on the field, but I don't think are going to be as much of a focal point and shouldn't be as much of a focal point. And so when you do their projection, it gets pretty exciting because you could see, one of the highest concentrations of any team in the NFL on three main guys. And I think that makes it very different, where it's very easy to see very high route rates for each of those three players. It's very easy to see a really high cumulative target per route rate for those three players versus a team like the Chargers and the Jags, where I found myself, like I mentioned, I'm in the middle of doing this big article on the Jags, and it's like last year, I have a section where I go through this pretty granularly. Like last year, they averaged 2.58 wide receiver routes per pass play, total, cumulative. And how many routes are you giving Hunter? Because if you want to give him like a 30% route rate, that basically leaves, an average of 75% routes maximum for each of the three other wide receivers, without factoring in any other wide receivers on the roster for any routes, and without factoring in the likely reality that there's actually going to probably be fewer wide receiver routes per pass play this year with the added tight ends than there was last year. And so you start doing this, and it's like, are they all going to rotate in at 70 to 80% of the routes? That would be not great. Or is one guy going to become like a 50% routes player of those three? And if so, who? And then the nightmare scenario is you look, they played 5 games only with Washington, Thomas, and Myers all playing the entire game. So no like in-game injuries or anything like that. And the one guy who ran the most routes, who ran, I think it was like 98% of the routes, was Jakobi Meyers. Who is the least interesting from a talent perspective, I think, and a ceiling perspective. And so you could see a scenario that's kind of Packers-y, where the one guy who's out there every single play is Dobbs, who's not the guy you'd really want to be out there every single play, but he's the guy that's out there every single play. And
they gave me a huge contract. They traded for him and gave me a huge contract.
Right. And so, there's a scenario where, Tom, not really this year with the Packers. They actually think they're going to get more consolidated. But you think of the previous 2 years for the Packers where, no one is particularly trustworthy because the more interesting talent bets are like Watson or Reed or potentially Golden or Wicks even. But they're not their playing time is pretty sporadic, and so it's hard to bet on a guy running 65, 70, 75% of the routes very consistently. And then Dobbs, just by the nature of who he is, like he's not a guy that's going to be a top 12, top 24 wide receiver because he's Romeo Dobbs. And it's like there's a world where Jakobi Meyers is out there, earning a 18% targets per route run on 95% routes. And the guys who flash more efficiency upside, more targeting upside per route are routes limited. And you get to a world where it's like, yeah, maybe the Jaguars have a really good offense. Trevor Lawrence has a really good season, but you're consistently frustrated by the wide receiver production that you're generating.
And I think that's definitely, I probably am predicting that if you look at my projection. The other thing I talked about when I wrote them up was even if they lose somebody, it probably, because you have this enigma in Travis Hunter, it probably just means that Travis Hunter's role expands in a way that you still have target pressure. Like 5 or 10 years ago, whenever, I guess probably 5 years ago, I used to emphasize, because it was when like CeeDee Lamb was a rookie and they had Amari Cooper and Michael Gallup, and maybe right after that, the Bengals had Jamar Chase and T. Higgins as young guys, but they also still had Tyler Boyd. And those are the two teams you mentioned that have been very pass-heavy since then. And back then, they were still very pass-heavy. And you had 3 really good receivers that all had ADPs that were draftable. The thing that I love to emphasize was you wanted to target that, because their ADPs in that landscape, especially in that time frame in fantasy football, were all held down collectively by the projection-based element of this is hard to dole out targets, but these guys are all good players, and they're all going to probably earn a decent amount of volume. And then if somebody goes down, it's going to concentrate on those players even more. And we saw some of that. Or if one guy really ascends, we saw some of that at times. And I do think that's very possible with the Jags. But the difference is when you take another 20% of the play volume and slice that off, because they're going to do some heavy tight end formations and things. And you have now the 4th guy in Travis Hunter when you're talking about the receiver stuff, that even if a guy does get hurt, you still have 3 dudes. He just accelerates his usage. Almost certainly on the offensive side for that stretch of time. It just makes it a really challenging thing to see how individual guys can separate and really be productive. Now, having said that, Parker Washington did have very good production on a per route basis at least, but I was looking back at his game log, and like even during that stretch, the late season last year, he had some games where he just didn't play quite as much, or maybe got banged up or whatever, but the production wasn't insane week in and week out like you might expect when you hear that he had the 3rd best yards per route run over that course of the season. But yeah, to your point about the Bears, it does seem like really regardless, it's going to concentrate on, to me, it's Loveland and Burden as the ceiling guys, and then Adunze is kind of the Jakobi Meyers of this analogy. He's he's going to run a lot of routes, assuming the foot is healthy enough, but he's going to be out there a lot. But if the year two guys, really break out, then Adunze is going to be the 3rd guy, and there's not going to be a clear 4th. My projection has all 3 of those guys for over 100 targets and no one else at 50. That's the way that I see that offense.
Yeah.
And that's good, right? And the Bears are a team that, we're talking about all these teams, that they look like they're going to score a lot of points. They're going to run a lot of plays, right? The Bears look like a very fantasy-friendly offense. You got a good play call. You got a good offensive line. You have a tough but not really absurdly difficult schedule. I think it will push the offense. You have some rest advantages. Warren Sharp does the rest advantage stuff. Theirs is the most favorable. So like one of the weird quirks of their offense is going into week 17 against the Lions, the Bears will play on Friday the week prior, and they'll have 9 days off. The Lions are coming off a Monday night game. So this is a late season game that may help decide the division. It's also fantasy championship week. Bears are going to get 3 extra days of preparation. And Ben Johnson's going to use those days. Like, it's week 17. Oh, yeah. I think that's kind of tough for the Lions. A little unfair there. But the Bears get that multiple times this year. They get 3 extra days in their opponent. They also never face a team coming off a bye, and they never face a team that has more than 1 day of preparation advantage on them. So, anyway, the Bears end up having the most rest advantages throughout the year. They have a little bit of an up-tempo pace. They have the potential for this concentration. All of those things for the Bears, when I went through their projection, they point favorably. Some of the, most teams, you have some things that point favorably, some that point unfavorably. The concentration point is one of the most important as we kind of wrap up this show for today and this concept. And the reason that we wanted to lay this groundwork with this show first is it gets back to this as we start to talk about the specific examples. It gets back to this idea of concentration and what we can target and what we think because I do think the meta and the scheme and the ways that teams are building depth at all these positions is going to drive fantasy value more than it ever did when I was coming up in this industry 10 years ago, and everyone could be in 11 personnel all the time and have 3 receivers on the field and do the same kind of stuff. There were still some run-heavy offenses, etc., but what we're in right now is a different, and when you talked about that equilibrium point, we're in a landscape that's closer to that equilibrium, I think, and so the good offenses, the ones that are going to score points and be fun for fantasy, are the ones that are going to find their edges, and I think increasingly they're going to find it through sub-packages. Look at the Broncos. That team, they didn't have the greatest offense in the league last year, but they won the number 1 seed in the AFC. They were a successful regular season team, and they did it through all of those sub-packages. You talked about the split routes. The way that Peyton likes to do it, he'll have one receiver with a lot of routes, Cortland Sutton, in the last couple of years. We'll see how that evolves, and we'll have to talk about Jalen Waddle and stuff on future shows, but everyone else rotating. And it's, you look at 2024, especially 2025, they got Franklin into a few more routes. 2024, I think they had nobody over 400 routes beyond Sutton. And most of them are in the 200s to 250 range, which is just not fantasy viable. I mean, you had some spike efficiency from Marvin Mims that year and different guys, but it's really hard to play because fantasy football is ultimately a volume game. It's really hard to play those dudes. It's really hard to play, anyone other than Sutton and Franklin last year in that offense. It became really tough for Evan Ingram. You and I had a team together where we ended up drafting Ingram. I talked you into that after I was way out on him because I bought into the Joker stuff and I thought Ingram would run more routes, but he ended up being same inefficient Evan Ingram on fewer routes is what we got. You look back at Jacksonville, he was inefficient, but he got a lot of routes and he was fantasy viable there. He had a season where he caught 100 balls or whatever it was and was very good for fantasy. So that's a great example of a guy who the difference in his fantasy viability in those two offenses really came down to this concentration concept. Which offenses are going to run the same guys on a ton of routes, which offenses are not. And it's something that is going to get missed by your average fantasy player. There's a lot of smart fantasy analysts talking about this stuff, but I see a lot of fantasy analysis that looks at every player like they're in the same offense, that looks at it from an apples to apples when it's not. It is never an apples to apples. Each of the 32 teams have their own situations from a lot of different angles. I was doing the Lions projection this morning as well. One of the things I think is why they're going to be concentrated is they drafted so well from 2021 to 2023, and then the bill came due for a lot of those guys, and then it becomes tough to have depth because of that. They paid Penei Sewell and Amon-Ra St. Brown and some of the defensive players like Aiden Hutchinson and a lot of these guys. They've already paid the linebacker Jack Campbell, but they also got to save money because they're going to pay Jahmyr Gibbs and they're going to pay Jameson Williams and all of these guys, Sam Laporta. I think they already paid Jameson Williams, actually, but Laporta and Gibbs, those contracts are coming. And that's all dudes that they drafted between 2021 and 2023, and there's more on the defensive side, all their defensive starters. That's why they had that little window that was man, they got all these guys on rookie deals. Well, now they're paying them all, and that's why Khalif Raymond plays in Chicago now, and David Montgomery's no longer on this team, and they signed Isaiah Pacheco to a 1-year, $1.8 million deal. I don't think they really even like Isaiah Pacheco. If you listen to their quotes, they're like, yeah, Jahmyr Gibbs is going to be our workhorse this year. Dan Campbell straight up said it. I mean, tacitly admitted they have a downgrade at number 2 running back, and if you look at that 1-year, $1.8 million contract, it's the league telling you as well, nobody thinks Isaiah Pacheco is that great anymore. We have more of an affinity for him in the fantasy community probably than the league does at this point. I do think he has some handcuff value. I'm not saying you can't draft him in any situation, but I think Jahmyr Gibbs is about to get a massive amount of work because when you pay these guys in their prime, I think Amon-Ra St. Brown is and Jameson Williams is because that's where we're at with the Lions right now. Their offensive line has seen some attrition as well because of this concentration of the contracts because of how they drafted so well and those second deals are coming up. And then you're like, okay, those guys are in their primes. We got to lean on them more than ever. And that's, I think, what you're going to see this year, especially with Laporta coming off a herniated disc. I'm not super optimistic about him from a health perspective. So that's a team that I look at and I go, well, their landscape is contractual and is a salary cap related one where they can't pay good money for backups, and that's going to impact your depth. And then you're going to lean on your stars a little bit more because those are the ones you're paying. Those are the ones that you expect to get you to the promised land. That's a team that, by the way, has the easiest schedule in the league this year, a 10.5 win total over under. Got through that, and I was like, they're going to score points, and they're going to score points in a more concentrated way, I think, than maybe I had realized before I did the projection. So, I mean, Jahmyr Gibbs going 101, but I got even more excited about him. But I think the other guys in that offense are pretty fun. Jameson Williams probably a little bit underrated. Anyway,
well,
important things.
We've had our first episode so far. Our first episode over 2 hours, so that bet hits at probably minus 1,000. I think if I'm trying to tie this up a bit, talked about a lot of different stuff. I think what I enjoy about my work, what I enjoy about reading your work, what I always really, really enjoy about our conversations together, and why I'm so excited to do this show together is the blending in of so many different elements, from the micro analytical focus to understanding sort of that larger picture, to understanding some of the ways that we can weave in the real football aspects with the fantasy football aspects. We spent a lot of time today on the macro trends, the more NFL focused stuff. We're going to get into more of the fantasy specific stuff, but I think you get to see a sneak peek into how we sort of dive into that from a pretty specific angle. And excited to do a lot more of these. Excited to do some drafts later in the season. We're going to get into some of the specific conversations of guys we're drafting, not drafting, and then put that to work over the rest of the summer. And yeah, I really, really enjoyed the first episode. Make sure to go and subscribe to us if you want on Patreon. Make sure to keep an eye out for wherever you get your podcasts for these to keep continuing. Do you have anything else to add, Ben?
I would just echo your thoughts. Episode. Yeah, man, I would echo your thoughts. I'm excited. I appreciate anyone who listened. And yeah, we're going to have plenty of 2 hour long, the long view, right? 2 hour long discussions. Exactly. I'm glad. Yeah, so as you were saying, that we wanted to talk about this topic first to kind of get it off. It's an easy one to go too long on. We wanted to get it out there, and now we can reference it. We can just say, hey, first episode we discussed this stuff, and be a little bit more player specific, as you were just talking about. And we got into here in the last half hour or 45 minutes where we got into some of these teams and how it impacts the players and how we're thinking about the bets on some of those teams. But yeah, I'm excited to get into a lot more of that. That's what we're going to do in the near future, is get into more of the positional stuff, what plays we like at different costs, and because we got to get our listeners up to speed quickly. It is almost, I mean, when they're listening to this, it's probably already past mid-July. We're recording it on July 12th, but it'll, we as we said, we kind of wanted to pre-record this first one and get our feet wet and then get the first couple out. And anyway, we'll have a lot more coming on the micro level, on the different positions and on how we want to play things. And you said do some drafts together. And I'm really excited to be doing it with you. I think this was a fun one to start.
I'm pumped, man. This is a blast. And I can't wait to see you guys for the next episode.